Salam everyone. We're just waiting on Ustad Rashid to join in.
سلام آینا جان.
Salam خوش آمدین.
خوش باشید. Salam everyone.
Zubair, can you speak?
Hey, salam everyone. Are we ready to go, Marina? Or
Let's start.
okay. So I'd like to welcome everyone to our space. I'd like to welcome our guest speaker, Brother Ahmed Rashid. The topic of today is going to be Islamist extremism in Afghanistan. So to start off the space, we wanted to go right into it. I guess in regards to the Taliban in Afghanistan, we see everything that they do, all their actions that they carry out, their system of governance is all in the name of Islam. So one thing that we want to start out with is the concept and the topic of what's known as the Sharia. This is a term that's obviously the Taliban say that they uphold. They claim to be the carriers and the upholders of the Sharia. And we in the West, and also as Muslims in Afghanistan or non-Muslims in the West, this term has become somewhat of a term that's misunderstood. It's become this boogeyman of a term that needs to be unpacked and deconstructed and defined actually in the proper sense, not in the sense that we see these extremist groups in the world defining it. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to start the conversation as a segue into the conversation. I just wanted to ask our brother Ahmed Rashid to describe this and define the concept of the Sharia. What does it mean? And what it entails from a classical definition, from a classical point of view in Islamic history. And then we can relate that with the actual Taliban in Afghanistan and other extremist groups in the area as well. So, Brother Rashid, if you can start with that, and then you can take the discussion in whichever direction you feel.
Thank you very much, Zubair Jan. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi at-tayyibin wa ashabihi ajma'in. Ay darun parware burun aray wa khirad bakhsh be khirad bakhshay. So thank you for this invitation and setting the space for this very crucial and important point and topic of discussion. Just to kind of set expectations and calibrate things accordingly. My aim in attempting to address the questions that are raised and the points that I'll be bringing up is for it to be an introductory kind of engagement, because these topics in of themselves, each topic and each subtopic requires very extensive conversations and discussions and sites and sources of study. So a lot of the things, for the sake of time and the space, I will keep it very abbreviated and short. With respect to the Sharia, this term, as you noted, is oftentimes thrown around and very easily utilized. So it has currency, whether in Afghanistan or whether in the diaspora or elsewhere. It's hard to see or hear a discussion of Islam without a reference to the Sharia. When you ask individual, what is the Sharia, they will automatically say Islamic law. But with anything related to either revelation, wahi in Islam, which is the Quran itself, or related to sources of narration and citations attributed to the Prophet, which is referred to as naql, we have to pay very close attention, and we have to be very much sensitized to meanings. Because when it comes to revelation in the Quran, meanings are the entirety of the revelation. And either the access to meanings or the distance from such meanings really defines how we understand or how we misappropriate religious knowledge. The term Sharia refers to, very technically or literally, the path that leads to water. Now, in order for us to kind of understand this a little bit better, imagine yourself in the context and milieu of 7th century Arabia and in this hot desert land, wherein any reference to water draws off in the imagination of the listener or the speaker particular imagery, particular sites of reference. And the Sharia, this reference or this definition as the path that leads to water, incorporates a very broad reference to the site and the meaning of water within Islam and in the Quran itself, wherein there are many different references to water and rain. And the Quran makes a difference between that type of water that is sent down, which human beings and others can derive benefit from, and also water that comes down that leads to displacement and punishment and other things. And then within the context of Islamic mystical traditions and spirituality, in particular Islamic poetry, the place of water is very important, and water becomes an elixir of spiritual refinement and purification. So within the broader context of Islam, the path that leads to water is the path of salvation. This salvation leads both to inner purification, but also to outer comfort and outer development. And the context and means of the Sharia itself consider both spiritual acts. They also include things related to interactions. They also have particular requirements in the context of what is the Sharia to uphold. And when we think about it, we generally think of it in the terms of laws. But the Quran itself is not a book of laws. Very few verses of the Quran refer to actual practical law. So the Sharia is derived generally by referencing both the Quran, narrations that have been vetted. This has its own science of correction, isnad, and attestment and verification. There has to be ijma or consensus between scholars. And then depending on the school of thought, there's either the utilization of aql or reason and rationality, or analogy and qiyas, or a mixture of these. And the Sharia should technically allow for both Muslims and non-Muslims, both the space and also the freedom to live a very respectable and honorable life. So the preservation of life is important in the Sharia, both for Muslims and those of other faiths. The preservation of property, this idea of the karama, or the honor of the individual and their worth and their standing, and whether it's social or spiritual, is very much important in the Sharia. And also issues related to both qist, which is socio-economic justice, and also adl, which is general justice, are key components of the Sharia. So when we talk about the Sharia should be understood not as a very dry component of Islam, but rather as something that is very vibrant, that is very flexible, that is very much to be consonant with needs and the requirements of the age and time that individuals are living in. Many times, the Sharia is misunderstood to be an attempt to replicate the past. And that isn't the Sharia, although some people assume it to be the Sharia.
Right. So that's a good introduction to the actual definition. In regards to the actual I know you touched on a few of the actual higher objectives, the maqasid of the Sharia. Do you mind if you go into perhaps starting with like the first one, right, which is preservation of life. How can people such as the Taliban, like, why are they in such contradiction and in such violation of such a basic higher objective of this deen, right, of this religion, which is the preservation of life? Like in all matters, how life comes, saving a life comes before anything else, before establishing your opinion of a governance system, before anything. Saving a life is the most important thing. Preservation of religion, preservation of lineage, preservation of property, and of honor, and these things are in clear contradiction with how the Taliban govern. So, can you just touch on maybe some real world examples of what they're doing and how they're not upholding these higher objectives, and then we can go on to a separate subject within this topic.
Sure, Zubair Jan. I think prior to engaging in why the Taliban or similar groups are in contradiction and act against how the maqasid al-Sharia, or the higher aims and approaches to the Sharia, have been understood, I think one key point that needs to be brought up that could possibly help draw out this conversation is a discussion on the issue of the standing of the human being within the context of Islam, right? So oftentimes, the reason why groups such as the Taliban and others grant themselves absolute right and absolute power to determine who is Muslim and who isn't Muslim, or to determine how religion can and cannot be used and interpreted, really has a lot of genealogy in both Islamic sources, but also in the way that the modern world has manifested post World War II. And also with regards to the idea of takfir, this idea of aligning or defining the other as non-Muslim. And the issue of takfir should really be understood as an issue of dehumanization. When you dehumanize the other individual based on generally political objectives, then the Sharia can do whatever you want to them, because the types of individuals that they refer to, types of sites that they refer to, particularly without kind of jumping around too much, particularly when we look into a very brief genealogy. So the very first group that could be referred to as extremists within Islamic history are referred to as the Ghulat, or referred to as the Khawarij. And these individuals, ironically, were very devout people, particularly reciters of the Quran. So they were originally referred to as the Qurra, or reciters of the Quran, and they were part of the group or the army of the fourth Caliph, Ali ibn Abi Talib. They disagreed with his agreement or his decision to engage in arbitration during the Battle of Siffin against Muawiyah, and as a result, considered primarily that those who disagree with them in respect to politics, or those who have sinned, come out of the fold of Islam, outside, or those gone out of bounds and other terms. And the Khawarij led a number of battles, led a number of attacks, including killing the fourth Khalif, Hazrat Ali, in the masjid while he is in prayer. And this bears much semblance and resemblance to the types of attacks and mosques that groups like the Taliban and Daesh and Al-Qaeda and Tahrik Taliban in Pakistan and others have engaged in, wherein they go into mosques, whether it's in Kabul or whether it's in Ghazni or whether it's in Kandahar or whether it's in Balkh and other places, and they blow themselves up, right? And this issue of who can be a target, this issue of what type of violence can be engaged in when it comes to war and battle within Islamic law, all of this is thrown out because the other individual is considered to be a disbeliever, a non-believer. So this idea of takfir, of political and religious opponents, is very much important. So I think more than talking about the very specifics of how do the Taliban lack the appropriate conduct and understanding of various aspects of the Sharia and its implementation, it's important for us to actually define the parameters of where and how and why do the Taliban operate in the way that they do, and draw out the needed genealogies and historical roots and traces of their philosophy or lack therein, of their conduct or misconduct, of their extremism. And that, I think, it would be a better way for us to kind of understand how we in Afghanistan and abroad have come to face the phenomena of the Taliban as they are. So starting off with the Khawarij, we do see, of course, various thinkers and others who have taken more extreme views and interpretations of various aspects of Islam and Islamic practice. But what has really impacted the modern presence of extremism and this issue of ghulat and ifratiyun within the Muslim world is an 18th century phenomena under the interpretation of, at that time, a Najdi Arabian leader by the name of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who dies in 1792. So he's an 18th century thinker who really leans in on the ideas and the very aberrant and distinct views of citing and considering anyone who disagrees with him and his views as being non-Muslims. This included both Shi'is, so people who are of the Shia, Ja'fari, Imami, Ismaili madhab. This also included people who assigned themselves into one of the various tariqas or mystical orders in Islam. This also included individuals who were Shafi'is and Hanafis and others, so individuals who fall under the category of Sunni Muslims. And this idea then gets wedded or gets tied into politics by funding through the British with the Ibn al-Wahhab Saud family. the Al Saud family and the teachings and distinct views of Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab generally form what is now known and understood as the country of Saudi Arabia. And we know then that once the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, the CIA and these Arab countries, very much in concert, aimed at utilizing Afghanistan as a site of both resistance against the Soviets, but also as a battlefield of testing out ideas and testing out various other mechanisms and machinations, which we haven't fully even understood yet. And one of the things that this led to is a complete shift in the way that religion was understood in many parts of the Muslim world. Prior to what we can say the 21st century, Islam had various colors and various manifestations which were rooted in the sources, in the canon. So they were rooted in the Quran, they were rooted in the vetted narrations of the Prophet. And the reason why I emphasize the vetted narrations of the Prophet, because of course, anyone who kind of is worth their 2 cents knows that we have a tremendous amount of falsified narrations within various texts of and books of narrations in Islam. So there has to be a science wherein narrations are defined and discriminated against, meaning rightly and correctly found narrations are distinguished from concocted and fabricated narrations. And even after it matches this issue of the chain of narration or isnad, there even has to be additional rumination and additional assessment with respect to whether it aligns to the character of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his. And of course, then other issues such as urf or local traditions, issues considered ijma, and various other approaches that they had. But with the power, the petrodollars of the Saudis and also CIA funding and other arms really incorporated and institutionalized was the shifting or the transformation of the madrasa, the traditional site of Islamic learning, into a site of political employment and political radicalism. So religion shifts from being a realization of the and a manifestation of a very authentic and sincere approach to being and becoming in this world. And it becomes morphed into a site of development of radically inclined, violently prone individuals that could be deployed at the behest of powers, at the behest of government, whether that's the CIA, whether that's the Pakistani government, or any other government. And what that does, in concurrence with the killing of multiple layers and destruction of multiple sites of scholarship and traditional ulama in Afghanistan, both within the Shi'i centers of learning in Afghanistan and the Sunni centers of learning in Afghanistan, is a void, a paucity of the traditional manifestations of scholarship. And it becomes replaced with a very extreme, a very violently inclined manifestation, which some refer to as a Deobandi movement, but the Deobandi movement of Islam is rather different now than it was historically. It emerges in what is now, in India, in this region of Deoband, as an attempt to conserve the ways and the attitudes of the local population against the encroachments of the British Empire. But the way that it was utilized and the way that it has manifested itself in the madrasas of Pakistan and Afghanistan and elsewhere since at least the 1980s is that it very much incorporates and employs the views of Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab and Wahhabism, wherein there is a violent tendency, because the Deobandi movement in its very origins, it seems, actually had, as the sources mention, it actually had mystical inclinations, right? Had their own interpretations, but they also incorporated traditional Islamic mysticism and tasawwuf into their fold. But we see many instances where in later eras, post the 1980s and onwards, particularly in the 1990s and 2000s, that these groups and these individuals coming out of these madrasas in Pakistan and elsewhere actually have very violent views towards the mystics and the Sufis, and they consider them to be heretics, they consider them to be non-Muslims, and their shrines and their practices and their takaya or their zawaya or their Sufi lodges are sites of attack, whether it's in Afghanistan or in Libya or in Syria or in Iraq and elsewhere. So when we talk about why the Taliban are the way that they are, the Taliban would argue, and Taliban sympathizers, and salam to the Taliban sympathizers who may be in the audience, they will argue that they come from the sources of Islam, right? That's their whole argument, that they are the individuals who maintain and uphold the true, authentic Islam Muhammadi. But upon interrogation and probing, we realize that they are actually a very development. And in reality, the Taliban and groups similar to them are a complete disconnect, and they have severed from the traditional scholarship and the traditional inclinations and tendencies of Muslims, both general and scholarly writers and scholars within the Islamic milieu of Islam and what it means to be Muslim. So they have turned Islam into an ideology, and they have turned Islam into a tool of political dominance and political violence, wherein historically Islam has been understood as a manifestation of seeking and searching and finding and becoming divinely inspired and manifesting the beauties that are nascent and the possibilities that reside within the human being. So a very philosophically inclined, a very practically inclined, a very tolerant and merciful approach to life, both for oneself and others, and has turned it into something completely violent.
Thank you, Rashid John, for explaining that. Yeah, I think that's very important for everyone to understand that this ideology is a recent thing. It's not an understanding of Islam, an approach to Islam that was founded by the predecessors of our religion. This is something, as you mentioned, that was recently founded in the as early as the 1700s. And what I wanted to become clear for everyone is that the Taliban's brand of Islam, see, why are they different than everyone else? And it's, as you explained, is that it's coming from this Deobandi madrasa system that's been influenced as well from the Wahhabi school. So these are things that ordinary people from Afghanistan and Central Asia do not relate with. From our ancestors and our previous generations, we see that Afghanistan was a land of development in terms of Islamic thought in regards to the golden age of Islam. How many scholars contributed to the golden age of Islam from our very country? So that's something that needed to be addressed. But moving forward, how can we discuss the concept, I guess, of compulsion? We all know the famous verse from Surah Al-Baqarah that goes, "La ikraha fi din." There's no compulsion in religion, right? So can you expand on the idea, the concept of compulsion, jabr in Islam, and maybe if you can refer to certain texts or a hadith or verses from the Quran and Sunnah regarding this concept, and how the Taliban are in conflict with this as well, because this is something that we see in the Muslim world, where these extremist groups, and in this case the Taliban, are forcing their views on people, especially in a narrative that's not in accordance with mainstream Islam. So if you can discuss that.
Sure. Thank you, Zubayjan, for bringing up that important point. So the idea of jabr and ikhtiyar, this issue of compulsion and free will or choice, has multiple manifestations and sort of genealogies within Islam, both in the context of Islamic theology, and then also in how it has been utilized and weaponized by various governments and centers of rule, whether during the Umayyad dynasty or during the Abbasid dynasty, and how scholarship, and this is also important for us to note with regards to the situation in Afghanistan, both in the past and of course also in the present, of how governments tend to weaponize the views and the rubber stamp of certain scholars for their own political gains and for their own political means. But as you noted in chapter 2 of the Quran, in verse 256, there is the very famous ayah and verse which says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, La ikraha fi din. There is no compulsion in religion. And compulsion could be understood here to be force. So when it comes to religion, if we just briefly kind of ruminate and cogitate on the broader meanings of it, is religion something that is forced down on the human being, or is religion something that the human being is forced to reflect and ultimately either accept or reject? And within the Quran itself, there's a very clear theme that appears. And that is that the human being has the option and the availability and also the responsibility of choice. Human being has not been compulsed or forced by God to be a certain religion, quote unquote. This idea of Islam, this idea of knowingly surrendering into the will of God, into the religion of God, is something that the human being must come to terms with on his or her own terms. We know from within the Quranic sources and also narrations in general that the Quran actually deeply criticizes those communities and those categories of individuals who simply adhere to and believe in religion based on their ancestors and forefathers and others without any type of active engagement on their own, right? Because this tends to become a very cemented and dry understanding of reality. Everything that the past has done is not true, nor is it correct. But what is required of the individual in the present, whatever that present may be, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years from now, depending on whether climate catastrophe is going to bring out the sea level rise to a place where we all have to live in submarines or not. We don't know that yet. But the point is, whatever the present may be, the individual is responsible for the task reflection and cogitation and deep connection with the questions of who am I? What is my purpose? What is the potential and possibilities of life and afterlife and other things? So the human being has this choice. It's clear in the Quran, and many verses mention that if God had wanted, God would have made human beings all into one. In many verses of the Quran, the Prophet is consoled, noting that past people and past communities rejected the message of messengers and the call of messengers. And the Prophet is not responsible except for the deliverance of the message itself. And this is important because it ties. Two things are important, right? First is that verse, which is very clear in its meaning. It's not mutashabih, it's not sort of covered in any type of mystery, but it's something that's very clear, and it's mubin. And also, when it comes to the interpretation and the manifestation of these verses according to the life and times of the Prophet, we also know that there is no proof in which the Prophet used force to convert someone or to enforce a particular behavior on an individual. And this is very important because we see in the modern times and in the modern world many instances where these extremist ghulat and khawarij groups like the Taliban and Daesh and others, they actually interrogate individuals with respect to their religiosity, right? So by religiosity, we mean the practice, the daily practice and commitment to the requirements of religious life. That could be understood as daily prayer, that could be understood as the reflective supplications and the adhkar or hymns of remembrance. This could be understood as maintaining a distinction between halal and haram and so forth. So we know, for instance, that in places like Syria, groups such as Daesh and al-Nusra and others, and if the NSA is surely listening, we also say salam to them. These individuals stopped people on the road. They stopped people in towns and in cities that came under their control. They interrogated them with regards to whether they're Muslim or not, with regards to what madhab they are, with regards to certain prayers and certain surahs of the Quran and other things. And there are many documented instances where they killed people because they did not know something or because they said something incorrectly, or it turned out that they are non-Muslims. This is a clear contradiction of the sunnah of the Prophet himself, because there's no instance in any source wherein the Prophet stopped people or the Prophet told the people within Medina or within Mecca and others, let alone who are non-Muslims, but even Muslims were to be stopped and questioned and interrogated with regards to, did you pray, or you must come to the mosque. If you don't come to the mosque, then there should be violence and other things that are inflicted upon you. So again, making religion into an ideology is a very modern thing. It's a weaponization of religion. It is something that has been at the disposal and deployment of both hegemonic powers, but also local powers, including Abdurrahman Khan and his weaponization of the Sharia and his weaponization of Islamic law for his own expansionist policies in Afghanistan, including the very violent attacks on the region that is now known as Nuristan, and the very violent and brutal attacks on Hazarajat and other places in Afghanistan. The way that he was able to imprison and silence individuals who disagreed with him. So this weaponization is, of course, very much there. Now, the idea of jabr or compulsion, in addition to the verses of the Quran, has a philosophical and rather theological component to it as well, which is the issue of are human beings responsible for their actions, or is there the idea of predetermination, right? So this idea of jabr is also tied to that. Are human beings predisposed and predetermined to act in particular ways? And the Islamic sources and scholarship has varying views, right? Some people say yes, human beings ultimately are predetermined, and others will say no. Human beings have choice. You all have arrived here and have connected to the space out of your own choice. You woke up and you had certain items for breakfast or lunch or dinner, wherever you may be located, out of choice. You wear your hair a certain way, you have favorite colors, etc. But more broadly, they say that if the human being did not have choice, that on the day of judgment, when people are divided into the categories of the muhsineen and those who are beautifully righteous, and then those who are the losers on the day of judgment, meaning those who have wronged and oppressed their own selves, this would be something that is unjust, because both of those categories were predetermined towards either good or evil, and they had no choice in of themselves. And the idea of choice and the lack of choice in this case would then be a contradiction of God's justice. And we know very clearly that God is just. So this is very important, and again, it's a very drawn out and very long discussion, which touches on multiple points. However, the way that it has been employed and weaponized by governments, both in the past and some in the present, is that this idea of jabr and this idea of compulsion or even predeterminism means that you cannot oppose unjust rulers, right? So this idea, notice how the Taliban and others consistently call on bay'ah, right? They want you to share and pledge allegiance to some guy who no one knows, who has not written any scholarly works, we don't know anything really about, who regular individuals have no access to. We know when the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his, when people gave allegiance to him, not only did they see the Prophet, but many shook the hands of the Prophet, and women would put their hands in water, and the Prophet would also put his hands in water as a form of the bay'ah or conveying that allegiance to the Prophet. But the bay'ah or the allegiance that they want is actually capitulation, it's surrender. And what it means is that the individual, the citizen, the human being, the Muslim, has no choice and has no voice in determining how and by whom he or she or that society should be ruled. And they apply these very grand titles, such as Amirul Mu'mineen, right? The leader of all of those who have informed belief, informed faith. And they say that Amirul Mu'mineen and adherence to the Amirul Mu'mineen is wajib, and it's mandatory upon individuals, and you must give it. So again, the historical basis for this, before drawing this out too much, is that this idea of Jabr was used by unjust governments, right? And during the time of the Umayyads and Abbasids and others. And even in the modern time in the Arab world, there are some who say that, you should not criticize and you should not speak out against governments, because it's this idea of fasad, this idea that contradicting rule will create disharmony and disunity within society. And it's used as a weapon to silence people so that they cannot bring into question or call into question the unjust policies and abuses of governments and groups who have the reins of power over them. So for the Taliban, if you gain power, if you gain political power, irrespective of how you've gained political power, if political power was gained by being a proxy of the ISI, of having contacts with the Russians, of having various stages of contact with the United States through Khalilzad and the deal that handed Afghanistan over to them, if it is through this campaign and this reign of terror and violence and oppression and suicide bombings and IEDs and others, it doesn't matter, because as soon as you gain political power means political authority. And political authority then means that the population must give allegiance and bay'ah to them. It's really, in more simple terms, an issue of compulsion. So you are compulsed to accept them, and you have no choice to question them. So that's how I would understand it. And again, very briefly, there's no clear example. There's no evidence of this in the life of the Prophet and also in the life of the Khulafa Rashidun. There are even clear distinctions where the Prophet, of course, criticizes not only violence, but even the threat of violence. There's a very famous narration in Sahih Bukhari, which I will just abbreviate here. That's the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his, had borrowed some money from a Jew. And the agreement was that the money would be paid back to the individual at a certain date and a certain time. And the individual accosts the Prophet prior to the due date and uses some very harsh and unbecoming words towards the Prophet. And the second Khalif, Umar ibn Khattab, is there, and in anger he draws out his sword and says that because of the words that you have used to disrespect the Prophet, again, I'm paraphrasing and abbreviating this narration here, but this is the gist of it, because of the terms and the words that you have used against the Prophet, I should strike your head, or I will strike your head. And the Prophet reprimands Khalif Umar radiallahu anh, and says that go and bring what is owed of him, right? And pay him additional, or pay him more, because of how you treated him, because of how you spoke to him, right? So not only is this issue of violence, but even the threat of violence something that we have clear examples of from the life of the Prophet himself that he was very much against, let alone the general themes and ayat and verses within the Quran, such as in chapter 2, verse 256, but also others, and also this theme that individuals cannot be compulsed to accept, and they have not been compulsed by God to accept. Because of course, if someone is a theist and someone believes in the divine and divinely inspired religions, then they know and they believe that God is all powerful. Because God is all powerful, of course, God can compulse individuals to be certain ways, wherein this option and this choice would not be available to them. But we can see clearly within the sources and within practical deployment of practical reason that this is not the case.
I wanted to ask a question in regards to women and how they're viewed in a historic perspective in Islam, such as what role do women play within the Islamic understanding of life, society, and gender? And most importantly, how did Islam revolutionize the concept of women within the Islamic orthodoxy, or you could say like within the Islamic Sunnah, if you could answer that?
How much time do we have, Marina John? 3 hours? Because that's a very good question, but a question that, of course, requires a lot of reflection, a lot of time. With respect to women in Islam, let's just start off there. There are two things. One thing that I think it's important for me to mention briefly for those in the audience is that we have something referred to as Isra'iliyat within Islamic tradition. What Isra'iliyat really refers to is the interpolation and interjection of non-Islamic sources to interpret Islamic sources. And by this, it generally refers to Christian or Jewish ideas and thoughts that are used to either interpret Islam and or that are passed off as Islamic. And earlier I referred to concocted or fabricated narrations. Many of the fabricated narrations related to whether it's theology or role of women and other things. Sometimes it even finds its way into tafsir and exegesis of the Quran, or actually Isra'iliyat. So when it comes to the role of women and the standing of women, I would say three things are key. Number one is that unlike other religions, Islam does not form any type of distinction between the spiritual value of the male and the spiritual value and the results of those spiritual acts between the male and the female. This is number one. Number two is in the category of hierarchy. There isn't a hierarchy in Islam with respect to men being more spiritually potent than women are. And I'll add on to this in just a moment. And number three, that the key determinant, according to the Quran, for the hierarchy of any individual is God consciousness, right? Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum is the very clear verse in the Quran, that truly, verily, the one who is most honored of you in the sight of God or with God is the one who is most God conscious, the one who is most purified and committed in the beautiful conduct of reflection and mindfulness of God, and also this consciousness of God as well. And then we have other instances, for example, in Surah An-Nisa, which the chapter of the Quran, chapter on the woman, that very clearly aligns the male and the female of being of one essence. The clear text that it uses, or the clear words that the verse uses, is min nafsin wahida, of the same nafs, of the same essence, of the same material, of the same source. Now, this verse is very important because I started us off by referring to Israeliyat, right? These interjections within Islamic sources that are not Islamic in itself, and oftentimes are clear contradictions of the Quran. And narrations that have made their way into some tafasir that are Israeliyat are in one way a result of this component of the first verse of Surah An-Nisa being misinterpreted by the exegesis or explanation utilizing the very Judeo-Christian notion that Eve, this being, this model being, the first beings, the first human beings as we understand them, Adam and Eve, is created from the ribcage of Adam. So Eve is the ribcage of Adam, and then that automatically places a particular hierarchy, meaning that Adam is the ideal being, and Eve, in turn, is created for this ideal being and is a component or is a percentage of this ideal being. This, in turn, then draws into how spiritual efficacy and spiritual potency varies between the male and the female. Of course, with regards to the Judeo-Christian notion of the fall from heaven or the fall from that garden, it's that the female or the feminine or Eve is responsible for the temptation and all of that. But Islam takes a completely different role from it. We know that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his, contradicted the norms and the standards of society. We've all heard this, so I don't need to really speak on it too much, but some very clear things that oftentimes are not referred to, beyond the fact that we know that, for example, the birth of a daughter in that era was considered to be a bad omen and a curse. Of course, we could argue from a sociological, anthropological perspective that there's issues of finance and other things, just like we see in modern-day Afghanistan, issues such as the dowry and other things, but also this idea that the woman was not as preferred as the male for various reasons. One of them was spiritual. Although a polytheistic society, Arabian society was a society that had religious inclinations, whatever those religious inclinations may have been. But things that are less referred to with regards to the traditions of the Prophet are things that actually deal with respect towards women. So, for example, we know in the sources that the Prophet would stand up every time his daughter Fatima would enter or leave. This is a very simple thing, possibly, but it's a very profound thing at the same time. We also have instances in the sources that the Prophet engaged in housework. I know in modern Afghan culture, it seems that there is a do not enter zone for many men when it comes to the kitchen or when it comes to turning on the vacuum and other things. But there are clear instances that the Prophet and others, for example, Hazrat Ali and others, engaged in housework, whether it was cooking, whether it was sweeping, whether it was washing dishes and helping, knead flour and other things. So I mentioned this because when it comes to women, there isn't any type of Sharia requirement for the woman to be the cook of the house, right? Or for the woman to be someone who must change the diapers or must provide food for the child. We actually have a notion within the Sharia that the female can ask for compensation for breastfeeding a child. She can ask for compensation when it comes to doing work in the household, right? Other things, as you folks know, related to the independence, the financial independence of the female with regards to her own income, things related to knowledge that Islam emphasizes, the very famous narration of the Prophet, that pursuing and acquiring knowledge is mandatory upon every Muslim, male and female. And then from the very practical life of the Prophet, we know, first and foremost, we know the names of the wives of the Prophet. And we don't know we don't know the names of any wives of these talibs or anyone else. If they are, for example, such great Muslims and they follow the sunnah of the Prophet, how come no one knows their wives? Who are they? What they are? Are they real? What do they do? Etc. Quite contrary, we know a tremendous amount about the Prophet's wife, Bibi Khadija. We know a tremendous amount about the Prophet's wife, Salama. We know a tremendous amount about the Prophet's wife, Bibi Aisha. And they, in turn, were individuals. We know a tremendous amount about the Prophet's daughter, Bibi Fatima, and others, wherein not only were they individuals who were very active and engaged with the Prophet, but they were active and accessible and engaged with society at large. And they were sources of knowledge. They were sources of scholarship. They were sources of narrating traditions of the Prophet and other things. And throughout, they even gave political speeches. There's a very famous political talk of Bibi Fatima that's referred to as the Khutbah of Fadak, that is given at the mosque in in opposition to Hazrat Abu Bakr. These are very clear examples that we have of contestation and of disagreement and of the presence of female voices within Islamic history. We also see then later on, kind of bringing it a little bit more modern in the context of this area of now it is Afghanistan and Samarkand and Bukhara and this wider region of clear instances of women being leaders in mystical orders. We know, just to kind of bring it a little bit more and prod and antagonize the nationalism of many people who say, for example, Maulana Jalaluddin Balkhi was Afghan, even though this idea of Afghanistan as a nation did not exist during the time that he lived. But we know that many of his teachers were women. We know that in his order, the Mawlawiya, many of the people were women. We know that he had particular respect for women, both as students, but both as sites and sources of spiritual insight. Same thing with his father. His father actually very openly talked about his wife in his sermons, referred to the knowledge and the spiritual efficacy of women, and many other things. So this idea that that women are somehow to be removed from the site of public life, that they are to be confined to the home, that they are to be simply childbearers and cooks and other things, is again a deviation from the norms and the standards and the sources and the traditions and examples that we have seen in the past within Islam, going all the way back to the Prophet. Now, I don't want to paint some type of, Disneyland picture and say Islamic society in the past was this very cool place where everyone got along and people rode beautiful horses and said hello to each other. Of course, we have a history, just like any region, just like any country, just like any system or religion, that is marred by very dark periods, that is marred by very brutal contestations that oftentimes turn bloody based on disagreements on interpretation. But the important thing and the responsibility for us is, as both individuals inclined towards intellectual pursuits and research, or even if someone is just simply a Muslim who wants to know things better, is to be able to distinguish between the ideals and the realities of anything. So we have certain ideals, we have certain things that Muslims are called to understand, to embody, to assess, to exemplify in a society, in their lives, in their characteristics. And then we have some very harsh realities. But the key thing is we have to not allow these harsh realities or these misinterpretations, is what I argue, to be represented and defined as the true interpretation. And that's exactly what the Taliban are attempting to do. They want to take their very fringe and ghulu interpretation and offer it as the standard, and offer it as the main source and as the main site of approach to understand not only the role and the erasure of women from Islam, from society, from governance, from consultation, but offer it as the way that, na'uzubillah, the Prophet approached it as well.
Thank you, Brother Rashid John, for that explanation on the concept of women and the historical context, and tying that in with the current state of the Taliban. The next thing that I wanted to, well, before I even go into the next subtopic, I just wanted to mention to all the listeners that who are requesting to speak, or there will be a Q&A session after we're complete. So if you could just remain patient, we'll definitely call on people. So continuing with the talk, in regards to the Taliban, what is it that makes them so, how can I say, unattractive or deplorable to the majority of the people of Afghanistan? As we know, in Islam, the Prophet ﷺ was, sent as a mercy to mankind, right? And we see in multiple, narrations that his whole life was a model of mercy towards people, a model of kindness. And he specifically tells his companions and his followers to be gentle, and that God loves gentleness and he doesn't love what is harsh. And what we see in the example of the Taliban is kind of an opposite. It's a manifestation of that. What they are is nothing but harsh in their rulings and in their actions. And what makes them so disconnected from these teachings, these universal teachings of Islam, that mercy towards not just Muslims, not just believers, but towards humanity and towards creation at large, whether it's human beings of different faiths or animals. Why do the Taliban seem to lack this concept? If you can expand on this issue.
Yeah, thank you for that excellent question, Zubair John. Very simply, there's one view within Islamic sources and the Islamic cosmology, which is that the outer state of the individual is a reflection of their inner state. Islam could be very best understood as being a system of orienting and aligning and harmonizing the inner and the outer aspects of life, both individual, communal, societal, etc. This consonance and this balance of the batin and the zahir, of the inner and the outer, of the manifest and the hidden, is really key, because Islam is a religion that has a certain set of external manifestations, external acts. But these external acts are not the aims in of themselves. These external acts are supposed to be indications of inner realities. Now, the human being from within the Islamic and most religious systems that have some type of Gnostic tradition, and Gnostic or mystic refers to the seeking and the searching and the pursuit of the inner realities of things, right? So everything that has an exterior has an interior, right? There is, if you look at yourself in the mirror, you see your exterior, you see your face, a reflection of it, etc. And others see that as well, right? So researchers, for example, say that we tend to make judgments on a person that we meet generally within 30 seconds. We make very long-lasting judgments on how they are and how they are not. But there are entire worlds of hidden realities within each and every one of us. There are fears, there are hopes, there are desires, there are traumas, there are deviant tendencies that may be hidden within us. So Islam calls on an attempt to balance and to correct and to justify and reform these inner powers, these inner tendencies that reside within us. These can be the powers of passion. This could be the power of the intellect. This could be the power of force, of desire, of lust, of greed, of these various things. Now, why did I say all of that when you asked me, Zubair John, about why are the Taliban so unattractive to the people, right? Because the human being in his or her fitra and his or her own essence has been created by the Almighty to be desirous and inclined towards that which is beautiful. The very famous narration attributed to the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his, says, Allahu jamilun wa yuhibbul jamal. God is beautiful and loves beauty. And the way that Muslims have historically and traditionally understood this is to be a pursuit of beautification and beautifying their inner and outer states. So if we talk about material culture, if we talk about the art of the recitation of the Quran, if we talk about poetry, if we talk about the poetry of Hafiz or of Sadi or of Maulana or of Hazrat Sana'i, who, Hazrat Sana'i is the first individual to really solidify and generate a cosmology of mystical meaning within Farsi poetry, right? In Ghazni, of modern day Ghazni in Afghanistan. But all of these various instances are understood to be a pursuit in an attempt to beautify and to be sincere and to be authentic. And the human being naturally, in their very own being, in their very own DNA, in their very core and fiber, when they see something beautiful, unless deviated, unless they have hardened as a result of zulm, and the meaning of zulm is both oppression but also darkness. Of darkness, if they have deviated, then they will be disinclined towards it. The Taliban, I would say then, are a group who, from the very beginning, if we look at the manifestations and the creation of many of them, they are people who have no childhood. And from a perspective of psychology, childhood trauma and the loss of of childhood is a very traumatic thing that could be weaponized, right? So these madaris, these madrasas, and many of the camps and the sites that they are sites of violence. There's lack of opportunities. There's lack of access to information. There's a lack of hope and other things. And the system, as I noted, the weaponization of the curriculum is not towards spiritual refinement, but it's to create these individuals to prepare them for death. They are told that the world of this life is not worth living, and everything that they want from it's true. Many of them are really inclined to go and meet the Houris and women of heaven, and that's really what they, I guess, Tinder or Minder, whatever else is available in those camps, is not really helping them out too much. So they are inclined to go towards the hereafter, according to them, with whatever violence and whatever means that they are inclined to, because this world is not a site of living, and it's not a site of pleasure, which again is a contradiction of clear indications in verses in the Quran and narrations of the Prophet. So their actions, this brutality that they show towards others, is really it derives from this lack of harmonization between the inner and the outer, this lack of understanding the deeper meanings and the deeper aims of Islam, the deeper purpose of the traditions of the Prophet. The Quran clearly mentions two things I'll mention just to kind of then suffice and to finish this. One is that the Quran refers to the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his, by noting the purpose of his prophecy. And the verse says, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ, and we have not sent you, O, in parentheses, Prophet, except as a mercy, as a unique and generous mercy to the worlds, not just to the Muslims, right? Not just to the Arab, not just to human beings, but to the worlds, all of these hidden and manifest layers of existence and being. And then the Quran also mentions that within the Prophet is uswatun hasana, the most beautiful path and the most beautiful pattern of conduct is to be found in the Prophet. And these are just simply two verses in the Quran. And then a very well-known narration attributed to the Blessed Prophet is إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ. I have not been sent, I have not been given prophecy except to perfect ethical behavior, akhlaq. Akhlaq comes from this term, from the root khulq, which is an inner reality. And khalq, just a simple shift of the dhamma or the pesh into a fatha, completely changes the meaning of it. And it becomes khalq, which also is a reference to the exterior. The Taliban and others really emphasize this corrupt idea that Islam is this exterior. I mean, most of them, you just look at them and you question where they get this from. But it's also a clear indication of a lack and a dearth of a spiritual realization in the interior and a lack of akhlaq. As you rightly referred to, Zohair John, this invitation and this call by the Prophet to show softness, to show generosity, to show patience, to show mercy. There's a very beautiful narration which says, "La dina liman la muruwata lah." The one who has no gentle kindness and love has no religion. And our religion is, and this, the religion of Islam is a religion that deeply centers the idea of mercy, right? The basmala or the bismillah is a key repetition and inclination and call and reminder towards mercy. Another verse says, وَرَحْمَتِي وَسَعَتْ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ, that my mercy encompasses, it covers everything. God speaking there in the Quran. So the idea of mercy, the idea of gentleness isn't simply a notion that the Muslim should be should know, right, or should recognize, but one that they should embody. And we see in the example of the Prophet, this mercy not only being extended to the Muslims, but even extended to others, extended to animals. There's clear examples where the Prophet criticized some of the Sahabi for how they treated animals. We know, for example, that when the Prophet would arrive at a watering place, he would offer water first to the animal that he had ridden, and then he would drink it himself. We know, for example, that the leader of the Munafiqeen in Medina was someone whom the Prophet visited on his deathbed. And upon his visitation, the narrations mention that he requested the undershirt of the Prophet. His name is Abdullah bin Abi. He requested the undershirt of the Prophet, and as a way for him to have the shafa or intercession or protection of the Prophet in the grave and in the hereafter. And the Prophet takes off his undershirt and gives it to him and visits him on his deathbed, right? So these are very clear ways in which we know that there's a very important and oft forgotten emphasis within Islam of mercy, of forgiveness, of compassion, of care for the other. But we see the complete opposite in the Taliban. Their answer to everything is violence. Their answer to everything is through violence and corporeal punishment and shouting and threats. And we see the kidnappings and the torture of our sisters. We see the extrajudicial killings of our brothers. We see the genocide that they've enacted in Panjshir. We see the violence in Mazar. We see the violence in Badakhshan. We see the violence in Konar and Jalalabad and other places in Kabul. We see them kill scholars as they leave, an individual as they leave the masajid and sites of worship. We see them target and bomb centers of learning and schools. We see them kill individuals in prayer. We see them remove individuals from the khutbah as they're giving khutbahs. And the list goes on and on and on. And again, it's very simple. And without any type of emotionalism, without any type of any other consideration, it's hard to see how the Taliban, if not impossible, if not muhal, which what I think is it's impossible, that the Taliban can in any way be any indication of an Islamic system or a Muslim way of life, or how Islam has been understood traditionally, and even more so, how Islam has been understood in what is now Afghanistan. Quite opposite. The Islam of the people has always been a reality. It has not been an ideology. It has been a way that people have understood, and the milieu and the habitus of their lives have been informed by the inspiration and the teachings and the akhlaq of Islam in various ways. Even if someone wasn't, again, very actively religious, that's okay. But whether it's our greetings and our goodbyes of Ba'aman Khuda or Ba'aman Khuda or Khuda Nagar or Khuda Hafiz, the Khudai Paman, or whatever other instance or one of the languages in Afghanistan, whether it's Uzbeki or Pashai or Hazaragi or others, in addition to the language of Farsi, the lingua franca of the country, and of Pashto and other instances and dialects of the language. Or if it's in the hospitality of the people, if it's in the poetry and mysticism of the country, if it is in the art, and if it is in the dress and other things, right? This idea that attire should only be black, right? Wherein if you go back 150 years or so, and if you look at traditional attires in Afghanistan, in the land that is now Afghanistan, you see that there is color. There is the presence of color, whether you live in Hazarajat, whether you live in Kandahar, whether you live in Kabul, whether you live in Badakhshan, whether you live in Mazar, it doesn't matter. There is color, there is embroidery, there is an emphasis on beauty, but incorporates modesty to the way that they understood it. But to come in and to completely confine people based on something that isn't justified within Islam is again an aberration that takes place, but it's an aberration that is presented as an absolute reality and indication of this Islam al-Muhammadi.
Very well said, Brother Rashid John. Thank you for that explanation. I honestly think that that's the core issue when it comes to the Taliban. It's if they acted according to Islam in the proper way, right, according to the actual seerah and example of the Prophet ﷺ, and if they upholded these principles and these examples, I think they wouldn't be as detestable to the people. So that is the crux of their problem, which is, of course, there's other ones, right? How they govern and their use of, for example, suicide bombings and stuff, which are totally against Islam. So I think that's important for everyone to understand, which leads to the next thing that I wanted to touch upon, if you can explain. In regards to the Taliban, since they are so harsh in their methodology and in their ways, and they do a sort of disservice to Islam, right? So people in Afghanistan, right, the citizens of the country, when they lived under their darkness for the 5 years from 1996 to 2001, I think people don't understand the negative effect that it had on the lives of individuals in regards to the religion. They push people who had maybe a weak foundation on faith, who maybe are not as practicing, or if you want to use the word religious, right? they already might have difficulty with certain aspects of the deen, right? So then when you have these people who present the religion in such a harsh and such an improper manner, it pushes people away even further if it doesn't push them away altogether. And we see that, I think we saw that present within a good amount of the youth, or just the general population, but specifically the youth in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. People are, pushed away from the religion. They're not as inclined towards being zealous or, appreciative of the religion. As opposed to, I see, a lot of people in the West that grew up in the West, they appreciate the religion more because they probably didn't grow up with that kind of teaching of Islam. They weren't oppressed to that level. They weren't brainwashed or, coerced into living that lifestyle. So what would you say to towards the young generation, or anyone within Afghanistan, whether living in the country or the diaspora, who might be struggling with the faith? Some people tend to then, as they say, throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? When you see a negative aspect of something, you just get rid of the whole thing altogether. So what would you
Right.
say in regards to that? What advice would you give to the young people and to the society of Afghanistan?
Thank you, Zubair. I mean, I'm not in a position to give advice. I am in need of advice myself. But let me just add one thing, though, before I address to the best of my ability at this point, which is that you said, why don't people accept or embrace the Taliban? Because they are killers and oppressors. You can't expect society to embrace their oppressors. You can't accept a society to embrace their killers and their murderers. This will never happen. This will not happen. The systems of oppression may be very much ubiquitous and may permeate various levels and strata of society, like we see with the Zionists against the Palestinians. The extensiveness of their violence has been rooted and has been cemented in the lands of Palestine for a long time. But the Palestinians will never accept the violence and will never stop resisting the violence in their own ways, whether it's balloons, whether it's kites, whether it's chants, whether it's watermelon, whether it's debke, whatever it may be. And the same thing is true for Afghanistan. Our sisters are raising their voice now, and out we have others who are engaged in an armed struggle against these occupiers and these forces of evil, which is really what they are, and the society at large will not accept them. Now, with respect to the impact of the Taliban in turning people away from religion, this is an excellent point that you brought up. It's oftentimes lost on people how negatively and how much they have deterred the population in Afghanistan from religion, because they have, again, weaponized the symbols and the sounds and the sights of religion to be their own, to be an indication and a reflection of them and their own worldly political inclinations. And I use these terms very much with intention, their worldly political inclinations. The moment that any individual, let alone those in power, thinks that their realization of religion or the spiritual path allows them to consider someone else as less worthy than them, they have fallen into one of the most tremendous and destructive of spiritual diseases. And that is this idea of takabbur, this idea of arrogance and pride and consideration and ujb even, that you possess something that the other individual doesn't possess. So I personally do not incline to this calculation or this hierarchy that this person is more religious and this other person is less religious, because we have to base it not simply on the exterior manifestations of that individual, but on the inner realities and sincerity and ikhlas of that individual. Oftentimes, we see that the people who have the most firm and strongest of faith and iman in God are people that you would think, well, maybe they're not very religious, but they're very sincere in accordance with what they know. Like, قُلْ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهُ وَتُفْلِحُوا. We have many narrations in which people came to the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his, and asked him for advice based on what they can do to derive joy in this world and to be saved in the hereafter. And the Prophet says, قُلْ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهُ وَتُفْلِحُوا. Say there is no God but God, and then you will be amongst those who are ecstatically pleased and those who are successful. So for some people, they may not, for example, have certain aspects of religious knowledge, but they have a very firm belief in God. That idea of Tawheed is there, and people mature and manifest their religiosity in different ways, and Hidayah comes to people, and sincerity and Ikhlas comes to people in different ways. But the Taliban have been destructive because they've approached religion through the concept of Jabr, this idea that we are to make people become religious based on exterior signs such as a beard, or coming to congregational prayers, or wearing this or not wearing that, or not listening to this or not listening to that. These are very ill-conceived and problematic approaches to religion. And of course, it's not consonant with human nature. And our tradition has a very rich understanding and a very sophisticated understanding of philosophy, of art, of music, of poetry, of literature, of cuisine, of music. I think I mentioned before, of family, of joy, of laughter. And if you come and you suffocate an entire population and say that religion is telling me to do this, well, why would that population adhere to it? But the important thing is, for anyone, whether they are religious or whether they are not very religiously inclined, it doesn't matter. It is to be seekers and to ask questions and to research and to reflect and to ensure that they check themselves against this tendency and this very easy inclination of arrogance. Someone can become arrogant after reading one book. Someone can become arrogant after hearing one talk. Someone can become arrogant after memorizing one verse of the Quran. Someone can become arrogant by knowing the meaning of one narration of the Prophet. Someone can become arrogant by praying 5 times a day. The important thing is that we realize and we check ourselves against this type of arrogance. But the Taliban will never inspire a population. They will never inspire the people of Afghanistan towards Islam, because they don't represent Islam. Their motivations are political and their motivations are worldly. They simply use the facade and veneer of religiosity to achieve it. But it's very clear, again, without any emotionalism, where their loyalties reside. And that is in Rawalpindi and the ISI headquarters. That is their Amir al-Mu'mineen. That is who they answer to. And that's how it's always going to be. But Islam has been a part of the land and the people of what is now modern Afghanistan. It starts off in Balkh in the 7th century, early 7th century, essentially, 706, if the date serves me right. And it enters into Kabul in the 11th century with the Ghaznavids. And some of the most important and critical of Islamic scholars and mystics and poets and writers and philologists and with respect to people who were scholars of language and grammarians and others, have come from these sites of Balkh, of Ghazni, of Kabul, of Badakhshan, of Herat, of course, and other sites. So the scholarship and understanding of Islam and Islamic mysticism has been something wherein these people have not just been recipients of, but they have been producers of as well, and they have impacted it in a very, very comprehensive way. So for the fact that a few people who have spent 6 months in a madrasa think that they can erase and they can undo almost 1,400 years of legacy and 1,400 years of spiritual understanding, both implicit and explicit, is something very odd and something very audacious and rooted in arrogance.
Thank you for that explanation. Since you did touch, Brother Rashid, on the exoteric dimensions of jurisprudence or fiqh in Islam, or of how would you mention the esoteric dimensions, like the internal? Can you elaborate perhaps on that point just very shortly, if you could? That's something that we wanted to hear as well.
Sorry, Zubayjan, could you rephrase that question?
So you mentioned on the internal and the externals, right, of jurisprudence. We understand it's usually more obvious about the exoteric dimensions, but you mentioned that the esoteric dimensions is the goal. Can you elaborate on that when you such as having a beer? Yeah.
Sure. No problem. Yes, Chasham. So with respect to the esoteric dimensions, or in very simpler terms, the inner dimensions or the aims of Islam, for example, we know that in Islam, the committed Muslim is to perform 5 daily canonical or required prayers, right? And these daily prayers contain particular movements and particular verbal components and formulae. To perform it, correctly, one must adhere to it. And we have slightly different interpretations based on the school of thought or the madhab that one may be a part of. And this diversity of madhahib is also important, right? The diversity of thought is very important. This idea, enforcement, again, of compulsion of everyone to think one way, to be one way, not only contradicts basic human nature, but also contradicts Islamic scholarship and history and intellectual history of it. However, an example of an inner component or an esoteric or interior required component of prayer is we have a very key narration attributed to the Blessed Prophet, wherein he says that there are two people who are standing in prayer. I'm paraphrasing here. There are two people who are standing in prayer, and their physical movements and form is the same, but the reality of their prayer is a difference between the heaven and the earth. And what this refers to, in one way, is the interiorization of the Sharia. So everything that is performed externally should have an impact on the heart and on the inclinations of the individual. For example, when an individual goes into, I mean, there are a lot of mystical treatises on this, including on language. For example, treatise Nahu al-Qulub, As-Saghir wal-Kabir is very important in the context of how language in itself becomes, including grammar, itself becomes a path and method of inner refinement. But the individual who stands in prayer and they do not experience the inner components of prayer, meaning that they do not recognize, according to what the Prophet says, that pray as though you see God. And if you do not see God and you do not physically see God, know that God sees you and understand that you are engaged in this conversation and this embrace and entrance into God's mercy. There's very beautiful words of Hazrat Maulana and others who refers to those who simply incline or to push چون باطن بر سر صورت پرست. Go and seek the inner path, O worshipper of exterior form, because the pursuit or the realization of the inner path will give you the wings, or will give you the ma'raj or ascension that is needed on the exterior path as well. So, for example, if someone stands in prayer, but they do not experience or they do not have full concentration or presence of the heart when they are standing in prayer, this is a contradiction of the inner and the outer path. If someone simply grows a beard, like somebody mentioned the example of the beard. Yeah, of course, we have certain sunan or sunnahs of the Prophet which are exterior. The Prophet, for example, dressed a particular way. The Prophet, for example, had certain inclinations when it came to food. We know that the Prophet disliked, for example, having onions and garlic because of the way that it would make the breath smell. And the Prophet ate very simple food, and the Prophet sat when he drank water, etc. He slept a certain way, etc. But if someone simply ascribes or simply confines themselves to saying that because I have a beard, I am a proper Muslim, or because I have a beard, I am a more qualified Muslim than someone who, and then they stand in prayer and they have no inner reality in that prayer, well, this is a clear contradiction, versus someone else who may not have a beard. Yeah. Not having a beard doesn't make you non-Muslim. You don't have a beard, right? Some people can't grow a beard even, right? So we have istisna'at, and we have these distinctions as well that take place. Some people shouldn't grow a beard because it's all patchy and looks weird, right? So there's all these different things that are taken into consideration. But someone doesn't have a beard and they stand in prayer, but they pray with complete and full presence of the heart. They experience each movement as they're reciting the verses of the Quran. They're reciting it with intention. They are listening and absorbing the verses as they are being recited. They have an understanding of meaning, which is not confined to the simple verbal translation, but an experiential meaning in reality of the Quran. Well, then this becomes something of the interior, something of the asrar, or the mysteries and of the secrets of prayer, the secrets of the inner path. And for us, as people who are from this vast land, or who have heritage from this vast land that's divided now in Iran and Afghanistan and Tajikistan and Bukhara and Samarkand and other places, well, this land and the people who have come from this land, including such luminaries as Hakim al-Tirmidhi or Imam Abu Hanifa, I mentioned earlier Sana'i, al-Biruni, and others, they have attempted and they have been successful in aligning and making consonant the inner and the outer path, right? So if someone was a poet, they engaged in poetry, This isn't simply because they learned some language and they memorized some lines of poetry. They approached poetry as a manifestation of a spiritual aim, and they impregnated their poetry with inner meanings. There are complete books on the presence of verses of the Quran and narrations of the Prophet in the Masnavi of Maulana. And many other instances, right? There's a tremendous amount of these sites and these tremendous amount of these sources which show us a clear understanding and a clear pursuit of the inner path of Islam, and not confining oneself to the simple shell of external religiosity, but an internal reality and realization of religion. I hope that helps kind of answer it. I'm not sure if it didn't, then please let me know and I can speak a little bit more about it.
No, absolutely. That's exactly what I wanted you to expand upon, and that was perfectly said. So, no, thank you for that. In fact, hopefully, that's something we can have a separate space on one day. The inner dimensions of Islam, which is very important, considering that the Taliban and all that they do, coming from this Deobandi camp of Islam, which I have experienced myself with going to their mosques and stuff, and they tend to be very obsessed with the external. You know how you have to wear a certain traditional attire, and how that's supposedly the Sunnah. Wearing having a beard of a certain length, and if you don't have it, you're shunned. So stuff like this is very important. So that's exactly what we were looking for. So thank you for that. I think at this point, perhaps we can open up to Q&A. Unless you had, I think Marina John had to step away for a bit. If she has a question for you, she can ask that. Or if you had something you wanted to expand on yourself, Brother Rashid, then please feel free.
خواهش میکنم. I think I've said a lot. پرگویی کردم. I'm happy to open up the floor and field any questions. We also have, I don't know if Ustad Hakim is still here with us. I think he might have left. But yes, again, I think I want to just end it by saying that it's an injustice both to the intellectual history of Islam, but also to the lived reality of people in Afghanistan, which also includes non-Muslims, right? Afghanistan, until very recently, included Jews and included Christians, or particularly Armenian Christians at one point, and Sikhs and Hindus and Buddhists and others. It's been the land that is now known as the country of Afghanistan has always been a site of religious engagement and religious concentration. For example, Nawbahar and Balkh was a site of tremendous religious activity, right? Whether it's Zoroastrianism, whether it's Buddhism, whether it's other more local inclinations, such as the religious traditions and views and what is now Nuristan and other places. But if we're talking about Islam, which is the majority religion in Afghanistan, we have to be mindful that there is a very clear lived reality and lived way that Islam has been understood and practiced and approached in a very authentic way for hundreds and upon hundreds of years in this country. And for someone to come with sources from the 18th century or teachings and views that are espoused as a radical, reactionary sort of method to modernity and tell us, well, this is not Islam and this is Islam, and they lack the qualifications and the credentials and the lived experience both within that land and for that land. But yeah, that's something that people are required to raise a voice against. So again, thank you all for generating the space and for the kind offer for me to come and share some words with you today. I'm very much humbled and honored. And yes, I'm happy to hear from the audience. Thank you.
Before we allow the audience to come and ask their questions, Zubair John has one last question to ask you.
Oh, yeah, I wasn't sure if we were gonna. I had a list of things. I thought we got through everything, but one last thing, just to, I guess, wrap up the what you had to offer. So since we discussed all the problematic aspects, the contradictions between the Taliban, with ruling, applying the Sharia or their version of it in Afghanistan, what would be what do you think is a solution? I know this is kind of a loaded question. A solution or perhaps an alternative, right, to this style of governance. Like, for example, we see that there is a resistance currently taking place, and we know their interpretation or their views, which is more of a modern which is more of a moderate take in regards to Islam and all things. So, what do you have any opinion on that, or would you like to expand on that aspect?
Sure. So there are clear methods for rule, whether Islamic or non-Islamic. It has to be rooted in the will of the people. We forget that the Prophet went to Medina not because he wanted to conquer Medina, but because he was invited by the people of Medina to govern over them. And the people of Medina included a very diverse cohort of individuals and religions and inclinations and so forth. When it comes to Afghanistan, the solution is very simple, I think. All of the people has to be listened to in a way that is free from violence, the threat of violence, and others. This is something that the Taliban have never been willing to accept, and I would aver and offer that they will never accept it. It's a contradiction of their very worldview and their very being and inclination. They have been created and they have been weaponized to deploy violence as a means and as an aims, and as the only method and language that they know. So if there's calls on the involvement of civil disobedience, right, peaceful civil disobedience in Kabul and in Mazar and in other places, well, they will respond with violence. If there's a call for inclusion or peace talks by Ahmed Massoud, it's responded with violence and an all-out attack, including segments of terrorists, Al-Qaeda terrorists, and others there. And the Taliban themselves are terrorists, both by the very basic political definition of the deployment and the use of violence for political aims to convince or to force or to compulse a population to accept it. And that's terror. And the Taliban are a terror organization. And the people of Afghanistan are diverse. The people of Afghanistan are individuals who have various needs that have not been met historically. And there have been deep, historically rooted injustices that have prevailed and have been unquestioned in Afghanistan. And the solution is that we have to have fair and free elections. We have to have this barabari and masawat and this equality, wherein individuals, irrespective of their location and their locale and their ethnic group or their province, have the same opportunities and have the same resources allotted and available to them as someone else. Right. So this idea that, for example, that the president can only be X, or the vice president could be Y, or anything related to those lines, are completely misinformed and contradictions. Right. They're in ways continuations of flawed policies and flawed understandings. So we do need free elections. We do need the Taliban, if there is to be a space for them in Afghanistan, they need to put down their arms, they need to put down their violence, and they need to form themselves into a political group, a political party, a political organization, and vie and ask for the people's and earn the people's trust and vote if they're really Islamic, right? That's what they have to do. Now, with respect to how Islam can inspire and can serve as a model, well, Islam has a very deep rational tradition, both in the sources of the Quran and in the narrations and such, and also in practical approaches to governance. You cannot have someone who has sat in a madrasa come and lead a hospital. You cannot have someone who has simply sat at a madrasa and has spent time on reading, particular texts on Nahu to come and to administer a city or to oversee a construction project. You need people who are experts. You need education. You need an open society. You need opportunities. You need to understand that women are not naql, that women do not lack the intellectual capacity and means to do things. And you know who tends to say these things? You know why the Taliban tend to say that women should be confined to it? Because they're threatened by women. Afghan women have shown time and time again that when they are offered opportunities, they flourish, they blossom, and that's a fact. That's a fact. They can't tolerate it. They can't understand it. So if it comes to the realm of politics, if it comes to the realm of spiritual practice and efficacy, if it comes to the realm of literature, if it comes to the realm of teaching, yeah, our women are wonderful, but so are our men if they are given opportunity. And Afghanistan has been historically a land where many people have been deprived of opportunities, whether these have been, Tajiks, well, these have been people from Badakhshan, Kashan, these have been Hazaras, these have been Shi'is, these have been other individuals, even people who have been outside of the Mamadei kind of circles of power. So various layers and various levels wherein opportunities have been denied. So if we want a prosperous Afghanistan, I think the key is it has to be achieved through dialogue. It has to be achieved via an intellectually active imagination and nonviolence and elections and vying for this field of ideas to see which perspective can prevail without the presence of violence. Really, that's the key thing. And when it comes to Islam, I would argue that we have clear examples of that the Islamic traditional intellectual history and tradition, wherein rationality, wherein the deployment of spiritual authenticity, considerations of justice, considerations of istamara, for example, in Surah Hud in the Quran, it's very clear that the Almighty emphasizes the development of a land, the development of a people. The verse is, if I have time, just very briefly, it says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in Surah Hud, essentially. وَإِلَى ثَمُودَ أَخَاهُمْ صَالِحًا. And to the people of Hud, of Thamud, excuse me, we sent their brother Salih, the Prophet Salih. قال يا قوم اعبدوا الله ما لكم من إله غيره هو أنشأكم من الأرض واستعمركم فيها. That God has, I'm skipping here just to get to this point that I was referring to of واستعمركم, that the earth has been a place that has created for both your residents, but also for Umran, this idea of development, right? What development have the groups like the Taliban and others done? If anything, they terrorized and they bombed and they destroyed power lines and roads and dams and schools and other things which were sites of development. Again, a clear distinction. So if any group were to serve Afghanistan, have to be rooted in this idea of service, this idea of responsibility, this idea of honesty, this idea of accountability, this idea that they are accountable to the people, and not this grand idea that they are Amir al-Mu'mineen or X or Y, and everyone must be compelled to believe and do exactly as they say, and there's no accountability, and there's no sort of an accountability according to the Prophet. Justice is when the lowest or the weakest member of society is able to demand the right from the strongest member of society and receive it. That, I think, is where Afghanistan should be headed, and that, I think, is the only way forward for Afghanistan. An inclusive government, a government that is rooted in the pursuit of justice, of development, of opportunity, of openness, of options, of an economy that is sustainable. And Afghanistan isn't a site of simple donations where our fellow human beings are turned into beggars, right? So when it comes to women being denied access to schools and access to jobs and access to work and access to freedom of movement and choice, but when it comes to women sitting outside of non-wa'is and bakeries and bread stores or on the streets as beggars, well, there's no problem with that. We don't see the Taliban coming and beating them. And this is a complete travesty. It's a complete disaster.
I like how you mentioned that, we need to pressurize the Taliban and have like an open dialogue with them. But, as someone part of the diaspora, what, I question is how can you have a dialogue with this barbaric regime who is intimidated by women, right? They are not here for the people. They do not want an inclusive government. If they did, then we wouldn't have this resistance group going on today in Afghanistan, right?
Right.
So moving forward, I wanted to let Mariam Shireen to speak.
Yes, Maria, if I could just simply add something. Thank you for that. I actually don't think I may have not been clear. I don't think the Taliban will accept that. I don't think the Taliban will change. If they were to change, they won't be the Taliban. I've said that from the very beginning. The Taliban will never change. The Taliban will never normalize. The Taliban will never put down violence and the weapon of violence and the weapon of force and the weapons of barbarity and oppression. That is their reality, and that will be their reality. The moment someone who is a member of the Taliban decides to change, they will leave the Taliban. That's really the only way. But I think I was addressing what I think are possibilities. Yes, once we have the victory and the will of the people through resistance and various manifestations of muqawamat and resistance in Afghanistan. And the diaspora has a very important role in this. Once that has been established, then the way forward is a government that is inclusive, a government that is rooted in the pursuit of justice and development and openness and honesty and rights for people, right? So we don't want to replicate and duplicate violence and become oppressors ourselves. And unfortunately, the history of Afghanistan shows that whoever gains power becomes becomes oppressors, and the Taliban aside. And that's something that we have to be very mindful of and cautious of.
I agree. Mariam John, do you want to speak now?
Thank you so much, Marina John. Thank you to you and Zawar John and we are NRF for hosting such an insightful space. And thank you for Brother Ahmed for coming today and taking the time to speak with us and spreading beautiful knowledge about our deen and how we can take a more practical approach. We really appreciate it. I had a quick question for you, Brother Ahmed. I know that you touched a little bit on qiyas and ijma, and how we can derive how we practice in society from Islamic doctrine. I wanted to know if you could touch a little bit on the concept of ijtihad, because I look to that as our responsibility to do right by the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ, regardless of what the general consensus is. And I feel like right now in Afghanistan, that's really a kind of a little bit of a gray area, because we've got Talib sympathizers and we've got people that are absolutely against the Taliban. And we've got things going on in the background, like women being deprived of their halal dunya, right? Being able to pursue education just like a man, being able to provide income for their family just like a man. So right now, this concept of ijtihad for me is just really on the front of my mind, and I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit more and maybe even give your opinion on the matter. Thank you.
Bashashim, thank you, Mariam John, for that very important question. This idea of ijtihad is derived from the root word, which means to exert effort. There's a technical definition for it, and that is someone who has the capacity and the skill set to be able to derive judgments based on Islamic law. Ijtihad has a very rich history within Islam. And then we see a phenomena, if I may, wherein there's abruptly an announcement and an emphasis that the doors of ijtihad have been closed, and whatever ijtihad was done in the past is the only thing that should remain. And for future generations and future sources, there should be no newer or newish approaches to Islamic law and ijtihad, but a reference to the views of the predecessors and those in the past. So we have mujtahids, for example, such as Imam Abu Hanifa, right, and others. Now, this doesn't take an absolute hold on the Islamic world. There are some reasons why, beyond the oppressive components of many governments who, under the guise and name of Islam, there's also, we see a tremendous flourishing and almost a propagation of different madhabs, different schools of thought. So you have, for example, individuals such as At-Tabari, who has his own madhab, in addition to others. And many of these madahib, many of these schools of thought did not remain. Some because they just didn't have followers after a while. Others because they were very violently put down. But there were still within the Sunni scholarly tradition individuals who considered it ridiculous to suggest that ijtihad has ended. And then in the Shi'i tradition as well, the idea of ijtihad remains open, meaning that the individual is responsible for the scholarly and spiritual pursuit of knowledge to get to the rank and get to the recognition of not only being able to determine and come to a conclusion that such a ruling or such a view or such a consideration is either aligned and consonant with the canon of the religion and or it's misaligned. And I do think I would agree with you that the idea that ijtihad is closed is one that has no valid reason to it. That the responsibility towards the pursuit of knowledge, both at a personal and then at a communal societal level, is still something that is very much in effect. And there's very clear indications in the Quran that we can use to reflect and to broaden this understanding. There's a very famous verse where it says, Bismillah, وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا إِنَّ اللَّهَ مَعَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. وَإِنَّ اللَّهَ مَعَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. That those who strive, those who exert effort for our sake, we will guide them to our paths. And surely, verily, God is with those who are the doers of that which is most beautiful. To arrive at these different paths of God, right? So a plurality is opened up, subulana, and not simply sabil. It requires effort. It requires effort both on the part of the individual, both on the part of the community, and of course, on the part of the scholarly class. And of course, historically, scholarship wasn't simply a profession. We have indications, if we just simply focus on, let's say, for example, Balkh or Mazar or Ghazna, خدمت شما عرض کنم کابل، بدخشان، پنجشیر, in these different areas, you had people who had professions. They could be, let's say, a scribe, they could be a shop owner, they could be a tailor, they could be a mason, whatever it may be. And in addition to that, or they could be a prince. And in addition to that, they pursued intellectual and scholarly ideas and questions. So scholarship wasn't just simply a class where you go to a madrasa for a couple of months and you come back and you wear a certain robe and a certain attire, but it was really a communal pursuit and a communal responsibility. And on the set of the issue and access of women, yeah, of course, without any question, the Taliban are misguided in their understanding of women and in their oppressions, of course, towards women and others. This idea of sohba is very important. I'll briefly touch on this. Sohba, or gatherings of intellectual exchange and spiritual elucidation, have been part and parcel of the tradition and of the milieu and environment of these lands that I refer to. So outside of the wider Islamic world, particularly if we look at areas such as Bukhara and Samarkand and Mashhad, and for example Qushayr and Mazar and Ghazni and Kabul and these other places, Sohba is a place where not only in the broader context of a mosque or a takaya or a takia or a zawiya, etc., does a scholar or does an elder who is informed engage not just in a simple talk or lecture, but one that allows exchange from the audience. And this audience included both men and women. Okay, so this is very important. Women often were incorporated and included in these sohbas, and these were sites of intellectual discussion and engagement. And yes, for anyone who is a Talib sympathizer or anyone who is a Talib, really simply comes down to one thing, and that is an issue of sincerity and an issue of deep reflection and their responsibility, not only as an individual to their fellow being, but also with respect to answering on the Day of Judgment, if they believe as Muslims that there's a Day of Judgment, for their participation and their active support of the oppression and violence of others, particularly if those individuals are people that have been oppressed under the name of Islam. This takes it to an entirely different level of oppression. And most of these individuals, you will find, have their own complexes. There are disturbed psychologies at play, and there isn't much rootedness in the spiritual tradition of Islam.
Thank you so much, Brother Ahmed, for answering my question. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your insight, and thank you to our hosts for having this this beautiful barnama and letting me speak. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll pass it on to Zamrud.
Thank you for the space and the opportunity for asking me the question. Thank you, Brother Ahmed. I just wanted to point out on the realities of the 40-year conflict in Afghanistan and the aftermath of, for example, the communist takeover in Afghanistan and the atheism that was there, and the reaction of Muslims in Afghanistan being so extreme, given that that type of shock happened in the country, the violence and the torture that actually started from that time, and the communists themselves, whether it was maybe behind the scenes and then it overtly happened during the Civil War, and the Taliban, of course, as history shows, that came about by that extreme reaction. How do we put in perspective the American occupation of Afghanistan and the violence that occurred, and these new recruits in the Taliban that have emerged, maybe like they're now 25 or 26, they were 4 years old when the Americans first invaded Afghanistan, and their justification to join the Taliban due to their fight against the occupation, and their view that this was an Islamic fight, and that they were allowed to do so, and the joining of such being part of the Taliban is because of that, and their extreme reaction today is due to, like, for example, against elections and against women's rights, etc., is due to the fact that the Americans, for example, were very pro-elections, pro-women's rights, etc., and they're just responding to that, what we want to say, what the Americans brought into Afghanistan, rather than something of their more like Islamic interpretations, even though Islam gets the blame for it, but it's more of a political conflict between them and what the American see has been in Afghanistan. What's your view on that?
Thank you for that, question. With respect to violence, whether that violence is enacted by the Americans or anyone else, I don't ascribe and I don't believe in violence being somehow justified because X party does it or Y party does it. Oppression and violence and killing of innocent individuals is wrong. If it's the Americans and they've done it in Afghanistan, it's wrong. If it's the Taliban and they've done it in Afghanistan, it's wrong. To imply that the Taliban are reacting to things that the Americans emphasize, such as, let's say, elections or women's rights, and that's why they're so harsh, I don't think that's actually rooted in reality. The Taliban are acting from their misinterpretations and their ideologies and approaches to how they approach the world, how they approach others, how they approach fellow human beings. And there has been, as I noted, there has been a clear weaponization and a clear utilization of violence to be directed at a population at any time, political, emotional, and we don't talk about, and this is also important, we don't talk about the traumas of war that have been inflicted on the Afghan population, the traumas of suicide bombings and other things. And yes, the Americans have been responsible for much devastation in Afghanistan, the least of it being the mother of all bombs. But also, the Americans and the Taliban had no problem with the Americans when they were talking to them in Doha, and their friend and partner Khalilzad, as they were laughing with them. So this idea or this indication that the Taliban are somehow this organic freedom-fighting movement who is anti-colonialism is deeply flawed. It's not rooted in any scholarship. It's not founded in any evidence. And of course, you're going to have individuals who have been victims of bombings, of drone bombings and other things, Afghanistan and elsewhere, who can be recruited and their traumas and their victimhood and victimization exploited for violence again. And that can't be justified. You cannot justify violence with violence. You cannot justify wrong with wrong. And that goes back to my simple initial point. There is no hierarchy of wrong. Wrong is wrong. And irrespective of who enacts and applies this wrong, we have to look at it as wrong.
Well said. Thank you so much. We'll move it on to Mustafa.
Thank you very much for your invitation. I'll have a very quick question. Thanks for this room. There is a problem not only in Afghanistan but in whole Muslim majority countries. Populations, communities are mixing religious orders with the traditional lifestyles. But we can see it in Afghanistan very harsh. So have to differentiate this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a little hard because oftentimes culture and religion are conflated. In the case of the Taliban, we know that there are instances where there's misinterpretations or misapplications or confusions of Pakhtunwari or this Pakhtun code of conduct with Islam, right? And this can take place in other instances as well, wherein religion and culture have been conflated and wed in such a manner wherein many culturally active components are referenced and presented as religiously mandated. The only way, I would think, for us to be able to free ourselves and to correct and calibrate a more refined and more nuanced understanding of this is to go back to the sources and to ask the deep questions of, well, what are the ideals and what are the aims and what are the pathways of interior and exterior realization of Islam as a whole that requires not just simple rote learning of verses of the Quran and of narration, since we are talking, of course, in about the Muslim world, and of narrations and of the intellectual history, but to ask the very important question of where have past scholarship erred and made mistakes. Past scholars are not infallible. They are confined to the limits of their own time, irrespective of how good their intentions may have been. Right? The idea that Mariam John asked about ijtihad, the common knowledge is if someone engages in ijtihad and they make an error, then at least they get the reward for their ijtihad. And if someone engages in ijtihad and they come to a conclusion that is valid, then they get double the reward. So we know that past scholars have made mistakes. They have made invalid conclusions when it comes to their understanding of women, when it comes to their understanding of other Muslims, when it comes to understanding of non-Muslims, when it comes to understanding of various things, inheritance or whatever it may be. They were impacted and they were colored, and there was an imprint of their own socio-psychological and political norms upon them. And for anyone, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, anyone engaged in intellectual pursuit, the individual has to detach themselves to the best of their ability, because I don't think it can be fully done, to consistently question and to consistently allow for reflection to take place and ask, is the result of deep pursuit and authenticity, or is this a result of convenience? And that convenience can be the conservation and preservation of current social norms, of power structures, of sources of income, whatever it may be. So that's, I think, what's needed: a deep detachment from preservation, blind preservation and emulation, and an inclination and approach to deep intellectual and spiritual pursuit.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll pass it on to Orzi Jana.
Hi. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. This has been so interesting and informative. I had a question about religious extremism and misogyny. Um, I know that you've spoken a bit about the fear of the strength of women generally, but in all Abrahamic traditions and um, non-Abrahamic traditions and all over the world and India, I've been noticing a trend, and I'm sure everybody else here has, that misogyny seems to be like a foundation of religious extremism. And I was just wondering if you could explain or expand upon that.
Tashakar, Orzijana, for that question. I'm not sure if you were in the audience when I briefly touched on the difference within the Quranic tradition with regards to the role and the formation of the feminine and the masculine, the male and the female, with a reference to verse 1 of Surah Nisa. But when we look at the sources, yes, you're absolutely right. Within many religious traditions, the standing and the right of women is something that is at a lower degree than that of men, right? But within the Islamic tradition, not that every Muslim thinker and scholar engaged in this, but from the sources are very clear, and very easily we're able to locate this notion that there is no imtiyaz, or there's no supremacy that a male possesses over a female, right? The consideration and the requirement for any type of proximity or any type of standing with God is in relation to the authenticity and the purity of their God consciousness. And that's key. Now, with respect to why do extremist groups engage in violence and in this tahmeel, or this imposition of violence and restrictions upon women, well, I do think it's rooted in a misaligned and disturbed psychology. Extremism, by its very nature, is a deterioration of the faculty of reason within the human being. And if someone has lost their faculty of reason, well, they've also lost their spiritual consideration and calibration and orientation as well. Once that occurs, then anything can happen, anything can take place. And of course, women become, and they have historically become, the easiest and first amongst the first sites of violence. And of course, there are issues that we can talk about with respect to items such as fear, the power of women, the intellectual capacity of women, etc. But it seems that even for others, it really becomes the weaponization of the fear of the other, the fear of the unknown. The preservation of power structures, and so forth. And you're going to employ whatever has currency in that setting. If it's politics, in the case of the United States, you still don't have a female president. Hillary Clinton was a horrible choice. She wasn't elected. Not that Trump was any better, but the United States made a huge mistake, and historians will look at this with the wrongs and the calibrated attempts to deny Bernie Sanders his victory, which would have taken place. So here in the United States, for example, various things that are not rooted in religion are deployed in order to prevent women for certain things. In other settings, depending on what has local currency, that may be religion, that may be culture, that may be a mixture of it, that may be resources, whatever it may be, those things will be employed. So I think instead of looking at it through the lens of religion, we have to look at it through the lens of human nature and the inclinations of human beings to pursue anything in any means in order to preserve or to attain power. There's a very beautiful line of poetry attributed to Hazrat Beidel. He says, در طریق نفع خود کس نیست محتاج دلیل. When it comes to the path of self benefit or benefiting one's self, there's no need for someone to offer any type of reason. به عصا راه دهن معلوم باشد کر را. Even without a cane, even without an asa, the path to the mouth, right, to feed yourself is very well known and clear to someone who is blind. So when it comes to this issue of what serves me, what serves my interest, well, people really don't need any type of reason for it. They will do it, but if you ask them for a reason, then they may say, well, our religion say this, or our farhang says this, or whatever else it may be.
Okay, I think our next speaker is Nuruzan. You can go next.
Hi, so my name is Douglas Chin, actually, and I go by D Taza on Twitter sometimes. And thank you so much. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this talk. Thank you, Dr. Salim. I'm actually just down the street from you in Berkeley, but I'm
Wonderful,
actually, I'd love to get together with you sometime. I'm actually a physician, and so I head up something called Physicians Against the Trafficking of Women, and I'm also with the American Medical Women's Association. One of the things that we have been doing in recent years is kind of reframing certain social issues, certain criminal justice issues, such as human trafficking, from a public health perspective, looking at how, for example, human trafficking can be addressed by looking at kind of risk factors that might predispose someone to being trafficked. And so I've looked at some, I'm interested in what your thoughts are as to how certain public health risk factors might contribute to violent extremism. Things like job displacement, poor educational access, history of psychological trauma or physical trauma, social disenfranchisement. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on whether radicalization could be addressed through sort of public health means. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that wonderful question. I would assent and concur that absolutely radicalization has many facets that are tied to public health. Lack of accessibility, both to security, whether that's food security, whether that is sanctuary, whether that is opportunities related to education and other things. One of the reasons that extremist groups really confine and really are able to have an effective way that they can gain control of these people, oftentimes, most of the time, if not all the time, these individuals are recruited or forced into this. For example, they offer them food, or they offer money for their families, or they present it under the guise of, we're going to teach your children how to read, or we're going to teach your children how to read the Quran, etc. But really, their motives are ulterior. Their motives are to brainwash these individuals. And one of the ways, and one of the key methods that allows them to success, is that they deny them opportunity. They deny them access to additional forms of knowledge. And not only is this destructive with regards to what it does to the individual and to society, but again, since we're talking about the notion of Islamic intellectual history, it's a deep contradiction of the Islamic intellectual tradition, wherein Muslim scholars very readily engaged with sources from other traditions, right? We talk about, what is oftentimes termed the golden age of Islamic scholarship, or the golden age of Islam, which is really, it could be understood as an age of translation. This is a translation that occurs from sources in Sanskrit, some sources in Middle Persian or Pahlavi, sources from Greek, from Syriac and other instances. And these sources are translated both to be understood and for the benefit to be derived from them. But at the same time, these sources are engaged with, these sources are expanded upon, these sources lead to new generative ideas and other things. And yes, whether it's violence against women, whether it's violence against children, whether it's stagnant economies, whether it's public health issues, infant mortality rates, and other things, many of these, and if not all of them, are various facets of real public health issues and questions around public health, which oftentimes, unfortunately, is not part of the discussion. So I'm really thankful that you brought this up. And again, I fully agree. I do think that there's a clear link and there's a clear connection between these two issues.
Thank you very much.
And yes, I would love to connect with you. Please send me a message and we'll set something up.
Wonderful. Thanks.
Okay, so our next speaker is, let's see, Don Arteta. You can go next. Just want to hold you up for a second. Is it just me, or is his volume really low?
If you can, I'm having issues hearing as well.
If you can possibly speak closer to the mic.
Yes, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better. You're fading away again. If you can just speak up, please.
Okay, sorry.
Much louder.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's better. If you could keep it
Okay.
at that level, please.
Yeah. So there was a really interesting hadith from the Prophet, peace be upon him, that was that half of this religion is about cleanliness. But what it seems a lot of people seem to forget about is that it doesn't just generally mean physically being clean, but also the cleanliness of it. And so, just leading on from that, I just wanted to ask the question: is over the last 100 years, how has the systematic erasure of tasawwuf, by various factors, by say Wahhabis or even Western gatekeepers, how has that erasure led to the situation that we see today in Afghanistan and in the wider Muslim world? Because tasawwuf was it was the purification of the heart, and that science goes all the way back to to the Sahaba, to the Salaf, to Hassan al-Basri, to Junayd al-Baghdadi, all the way to the Prophet, peace be upon him. So yeah, I just wanted to know what your thoughts on that was.
Thank you for that excellent question. The requirement of the inner path, I do agree. The narrations that talk about that cleanliness of half of religion and other similar narrations are very important, because it doesn't simply refer to physical purifications through ghusl or ritual washing or ablution and such, but really the inner components of it, the inner aspects of it. And the Quran, as individuals may know, also has an interesting and very thought-inducing and provoking verse in Surah Al-Waqi'ah, which says, Bismillah, La yamassuhu illa al-mutahharun. None except for those who are purified touches it, referring to the Quran. And of course, within Islamic law and practice, touching the text of the Quran, the physical pages and script of the Quran, requires ritual purity, so wudu or ghusl, etc. But this has deeper meanings as well, which is that no one can touch or no one can grasp or no one can come close and be intimate to the inner meanings of the Quran and the verses and the various layers of meaning within the Quran, except those who have inner purity. And yes, the dissolution or the innervation and weakening of mysticism in Islam has been a very disastrous thing. Now we know that mystical orders have varied in their aims and in their approaches, and we know that mystical thinkers and mystically inclined thinkers themselves have argued against one another and their approaches. But in general, we can understand that mystical orders have been part and parcel of the Islamic world and Islamic society. And there have been very clear aims and methods by various powers to either to kind of prevent mystical orders, to generate their dissolution and fracture them, and or to employ them at the behest and at the orders of the state. And in Afghanistan as well, we know both during the time of the communists, but even prior to that, particularly during the time of Abdul Rahman, there has been clear indications of an attempt to weaken the structures of the mystical lodges and mystical orders, the taqiyya khanas and such in Afghanistan, because they were sources of local power, socio-economic and political power. So they were a threat to the aims and the approaches of government. And more so, I would argue that Islam is a religion that, unless one engages with the inner path, the outer path does not allow one to understand the fullness of the religion. This is clear both from the meanings of the Quran and its verses. This is also clear with respect to the actual practice of the Prophet, and then also the tradition of mysticism within Islam, both in the context of open orders and these turuq, these mystical orders and paths. But also we have to keep in mind that there are many individuals who are mystically inclined who never had a formal mystical order, and there are other ways that happen. For example, a clear example is the Mawlawiyya. The Mawlawiyya, which is attributed to the name of Mawlana Jalaluddin al-Balkhi, popularly known as Rumi, is formed after he passes away and did not exist in the way and in the manifestations that it possesses during his own lifetime. And scholars have deferred as to why that may have happened. some would argue that because he didn't want it to be a formal order, and others have opposing views. But yes, I do agree. I think that the weakening of mystical orders and their presence and their voices has been very detrimental. And one of the key ways for to heal is through these mystical paths and through a reference and a reliance on these very clear and present Gnostic traditions within the Islamic tradition, both in the context of supplications, both in the context of poetry and of literature and other means.
No, yeah, thank you for answering. Even Imam Ghazali's type of tasawwuf, which wasn't part of the Taruq, but yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think Brother Tariq Jaber is next. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I heard most of the conversation, and I noticed that there is a claim that it's just misguided for radicalism or of Taliban and other groups. But I think in fundamental in Islam, in Quran and Hadith, there are verses or quotations which call for inequality between women and men. For example, for their testimony, they need two women to equal one man. Also, for punishment for capital, if a woman was killed by a man, will not get the same punishment. And also for slavery. So I think it's not all of explanation depends on misguided or the ijtihad was wrong. I think also in our charter and in Quran, I mean, and verified hadith, al-hadith sahih, also there are many things which make an equality between men and women. For example, there is an hadith sahih, the man may ruin his prayer if a dog or donkey or woman pass in front of him. So that means the equality impossible between man and woman. Thank you for your listening.
Thank you for sharing your opinions, brother Tariq. Again, as I mentioned, there are variant interpretations, and as I noted as well with regards to narrations, there are various narrations which are contradictory many times. I'm not denying that. With regards to interpretations of the verses that you cited, whether it's with respect to testimony and other things, there is the science of asbab al-nuzul and the reasons for revelation, and there is testimony and there's consideration by scholarship. And again, the conclusions may vary, but the pathways to re-engage in the interpretation of these verses and to see how much the reason for revelation is related to a very particular context or it has a broad application is something that is still open and still something that is very much actively engaged with by Muslim scholars. Now, again, their conclusions may vary, and I'm not here to say that everyone agrees on something or that everyone should agree with what I'm saying. What I'm simply referring to is the possibilities and the methodologies that are present. Those themselves can also come under question with a very detailed analysis. So again, I mentioned earlier that the conclusions of many scholars is possibly flawed, and we can't deny it. We can't say that everyone who interpreted the Quran, their interpretation is valid. Everyone who wrote a book of narration, every narration that they possess is valid, even if it passes those things. So yes, there are clear indications of the transfer of the limitations of their own socio-political climate onto textual interpretations and religious interpretations. And as an informed and considerate and close reader of text, that's something that we always should keep in mind. But again, thank you for your view and voice.
Brother Akbar Atto is next. You can speak now.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Akbar, born and raised in Tajikistan. I have one very important question to Ustad Rashid Ahmad Salim. It's related to your point back to what you referred, Golden Age of Islam. I wonder whether there were any dissent voices among philosophers and poets at that time. What do you think about that? Like among the polymath of that that period. Some people might say that Omar Khayyam is a striking illustration of that, but I would love to hear your feedback about this. Were there present some um, philosophers who would speak about all of this, and but maybe they were not heard during this translation, as you said. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. With respect to dissenting voices, those voices have always been there, and those voices are still there, right? The idea with the proliferation or the reach of these dissenting voices has a number of factors. One of them could be the limitations imposed by the state and the limitations imposed by authorities and others. It could be, again, one of the things that we oftentimes lose sight of is much of scholarship in the Muslim world has actually been lost. We know that the attack of the Mongols led to a tremendous number of important sites of scholarship and important texts to be lost, to be burned. And more recent examples of it, for example, is the attack on Mosul. Or if we look at Boko Haram and their attack on the scholarship in Timbuktu. If we look at, for example, the attacks on Libya, if we look at, for example, during the time of the Taliban, on multiple sites of attack of scholarship and libraries in Bamyan and Kabul and other places, it's also the result of how much intellectual texts have been lost as a result of displacement and war and bombing and other things. So, of course, in all epochs and in all ages, there have been dissenting voices, and there have been voices that disagree. This exists in poetry. There's almost no poet who does not criticize other poets in his work or the lack of sincerity in others. So we know that it's a very clear human component. Now, you brought up the point of Omar Khayyam, and the thing that should be noted about Omar Khayyam, who is now mainly noted for his poetry or for his rubaiyat, is that he was never considered really a poet during his time. And most of the rubaiyat, most of these poems that are passed down under him, or under his name now, are really forgeries. They are poems by others. And scholarship really concludes that possibly between 12 to 17 rubaiyis are that of Omar Khayyam, and the rest are just concoctions. But he was known, of course, as you know, as a scholar of mathematics and of astronomy, and possibly a philosopher, though we don't really have many philosophical texts that remain, because again, for most writers, many of their texts have been lost. Someone mentioned earlier Imam Ghazali. Many of his texts have been lost. Of course, we have Ihya Ulumuddin and other texts that have remained, but many other texts that they wrote have been lost. And there are thousands upon thousands of texts that have remained unstudied in the modern world. They are in the archives, and they are in the museums, and sometimes they're in the homes and collecting debris in multiple places. So these are facts. Again, dissenting voices always exist. Dissenting voices exist now, but their reach and their audience varies for many reasons.
I thank you so much for your wonderful response. For those data that were lost, I guess it must be a huge epistemic loss for all humanity. And anyway, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Akbar John, for your question.
Brother Sharifullah, you can speak next. Sharifullah Wazir, if you want, you can speak next. Okay, I think our brother's being shy right now. I think if no one else has any other questions, we have hit a considerable amount of time, and if there's nothing else to be asked, I think we can probably wrap it up for today. What do you think, Brother Rashid John?
Bale, I think both the audience may be tired. We're almost hitting. We just passed, I think, 2.5 hours. Again, it's been an honor and pleasure, and I thank you all for your patience and your participation. And inshallah, if there's opportunity again in the future, we could continue this conversation and other related aspects of it. But I think for today, this might be a good point. So thank you to the organizers, Marina John, Zubair John, and others, Humayt John. And thank you to the audience for your patience and participation. And we pray and ask for your success, and we pray and ask, hopefully strive and exert effort for a free, just, and prosperous Afghanistan. Thank you very much. Tashakkur.
Tashakkur al-Shuma, Ahmad John. Yeah, this is going to be a series. Inshallah, we're going to be holding these spaces through We Are NRF, hopefully on a weekly basis. So next week, we're going to have a space, and that one will be in Farsi. We'll probably alternate. And inshallah, we'll make this a consistent program so we can, inform everyone of the all the. Is it someone trying to speak, I think? Or?
Yes, but John, I just had a question, but I think I've come a bit late.
I'm happy to field it. First
of all, greetings and salam to everyone here. May Allah's peace and blessings be with you all, especially Ahmad John and Marina John and Zubair John for hosting such a good space. I'll just try to make this a very quick one. I just wanted to start with quoting a verse from Surah Nisa, which says, "O you who believe, stand firm for justice even against your own selves." The reason why I have chosen to quote this specific verse is because I have witnessed that many of our Afghans have fallen into the trap of Khamparasti. Our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, went against own kind for humanity. Yet I have witnessed on Twitter and many other platforms that our Afghans have gone against humanity for their own kind. Especially when it comes to all the genocides and everything that's been carried out in Panjshir by the Taliban. I have witnessed that many have chosen not to speak up. And I just wanted to know, Ahmad John, from Islamic point of view, how wrong is Khamparasti and what does Allah in the Quran say about Khamparasti?
Thank you, Sarah John, for that question. Excuse me. With respect to asabiyat or Khamparasti or inclinations, any type of inclination which deviates the individual from the upholding of justice. And we have many various verses in the Quran, including one in which the Prophet is commanded, peace and blessings be upon him and his, that قُلْ أَمَرَ رَبِّي بِالْقِسْطِ, say, O Prophet, in parentheses, that my God has commanded me to be equitable and just. And justice is a very key theme and requirement and manifestation of the way and the path and the realization of Islam, wherein that justice is so emphasized that the Quran says, be just, not only if it is against those who are rich or those who are poor or those who are close or those who are distant, but even if against your own selves. And this is a very important thing because many people, even the oppressor says they went for justice, do they not? Even the Talib, as they brutalize and they kill innocent individuals, they utilize the sound of Allahu Akbar to justify their violence. And they think that they are working in justice, right? That's what their argumentation is, or that's what they want to convey. But there's only very few people who actually have the sincerity and the spiritual refinement and honesty that they are willing to confront their own shortcomings and they're able to confront their own flaws and their own inclinations and preconceived deviations from the requirement of justice. So the Quran itself is very clear. Not only is justice a requirement, but justice is so essential that you have to be willing to let go of any type of attachment, even let alone the attachment to a qawm or to a nation or to a language or anything else, even if it's against your own selves, right? An attachment to your own nafs, an attachment to your very being should not deter you from engaging in justice. And I would agree with you that there are many individuals who unfortunately I wouldn't use the term analyze, that's being too generous, and I don't really feel being too generous with such individuals at this moment. But they lack the honesty to see that their blind spots and their conclusions are not rooted in any type of intellectual or honest assessment, but it's simply a pre-verification of the truth, and it's simply confined to them feeling a bit unsettled that they are somehow related to other individuals or power structures that are rooted in oppression. And the ironic thing about this is that these very individuals oftentimes criticize and critique such attachments when it comes to others. So it's very clear for people to say, people who are anti-Zionist, and there are a large amount of people of the Jewish faith, Orthodox and also Reform Judaism, who criticize Zionism. And the weapon of the Zionists is that they label such individuals as self-hating Jews, and they label any critique of the the apartheid and the very destructive and oppressive systems that they have erected, any criticism of that or any calling out of that, including the very recent Amnesty International report, as being anti-Semitic. So there's a very deep weaponization of these terms and of these labels. And of course, the same thing can happen in Afghanistan, and it does happen both in the diaspora and others, where you employ a critique as being anti-Islamic, you employ a critique as being anti-X or anti-Y, you employ a critique and say that it is at the service of foreign powers and others. But at the same time, when it serves the will of the Taliban, they call on the international community to come and open their embassies in Kabul, those same embassies that were the site of very sophisticated and well-planned attacks. So justice is, of course, very key, Sarajan, as it seems that you're very well aware of. But it's something that is essential in Islam, and justice should not deviate from its responsibility because of any type of secondary or even tertiary attachment to labels and identifying markers.
Thank you, Ahmad John, for that beautiful answer. And may Allah give us all the strength to stand by what's right and just. Thank you.
Rashid John, is it okay if we just take this one more brother who has a question maybe or a comment? He joined at the last second. Is that okay?
Of course. And also I see Ustad Hakim has joined as well. If he'd like to say something or correct something, Hakim John, در خدمت هستیم بفرمایید. But yes, if someone else wants to ask a question, در خدمت هستم بفرمایید.
Sure. We'll try to wrap this up within, I'd say, the next 20 minutes max. So we'll see how it goes. Okay, Brother Shah.
Thank you, Brother Zubair. First of all, compliments to the We Are NRF team for this amazing and informative space. I've listened the entire program. I just joined later to be able to speak. Thank you for allowing me. Thank you, Ustad Ahmed, for being here. I really appreciate your extensive research and analysis on what's happening right now in Afghanistan and how they are hijacking Islam. One other important aspect is the side effects of this Islamist extremism in Afghanistan. Age of globalization, we as the diaspora Muslims are also being affected by this. Maybe this is like something we can dedicate in another space. But my question is, if you would like to answer, is how can we kill two birds with one stone? Is it a good way to approach the Talibs or the Taliban sympathizers to just call them out as Kharij or Takfiris or Kafirs? Or does it make sense to have a rational debate? I don't think that the latter is rational thing to do, but just calling them or labeling them as that is not also the option. What can we do to tackle these? What's the best way to debunk these fanatics? I mean, which method is the best way to debunk them and debunk their logical fallacies that they're using? The one you mentioned, like many reasons you mentioned. So that was my question. Like, we are dealing with people who are living in the West. I have like friends that I know for 20 years. We used to grow up together. They are now 100% pro-Taliban. And we used to go to the same mosque. And I'm wondering, like, dude, when did you get radicalized? So if I want to approach them and tell them, like, look, Taliban is not Islam. You're supporting the wrong team. What would be your advice, or what would be your approach? Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Aziz. Now, labels, I would really emphasize and say that we cannot duplicate and replicate the violence and the wrong approaches of the other. So takfir is absolutely something that we should not do. Just because someone engages in pro-Talib sensibilities and sensitivities doesn't mean we can disagree with it. We can criticize it, we can refute it, we can debunk it. But if we simply say, this person is kafir and do takfir on it, then we've become oppressor ourselves, and we should really avoid that. Now, the best approach, Aziz, I would argue, is that we have to understand the sources ourselves. We have to understand the the full color of Islam and the full manifestation of Islam. And what that means is when we engage in the research and when we engage in the intellectual pursuit, we're actually disarming and removing the monopoly that they want, right? They want to be the only individuals who can talk about Islam because Islam becomes their weapon in a way. They weaponize the symbols and the sounds and the sight of Islam for their own worldly political pursuits and for their own deviant psychologies and for their own disturbed psychologies. So the moment that you and I sincerely pursue the intellectual and the spiritual and the historical understanding and nuanced analysis of Islam in all of its glory, but in all of the ways that Islam was weaponized for violence by various individuals and various groups, we walk away with a much more nuanced and much more sensitive and much more layered understanding of its history, and we're able to find the roots, can very easily locate the misinterpretations and the misappropriations of the texts and of the interpretive sources to be able to refute and to counter their arguments. And if it comes to intellectual debates, notice that these individuals never engage in any type of intellectual debates. Their weapon is violence. Their weapon is murder and bloodletting and killing and oppression and silence. And whenever someone does this, it means that they actually don't have the capacity to intellectually engage. And you can only expect to have an intellectual and scholarly and nuanced and kind of comprehensive conversation with someone who approaches it the same way. But the moment that someone doesn't like what you're saying and resorts back to this takya kalam of takfir, there's really nothing left, and it's a ziyah of your waqt, it's a waste of your time. So instead of focusing on them, we actually have to focus on ourselves. We have to form the sites and the centers and the collectives of support, of encouragement, of connections, of informed analysis, of education, of writing, of research, and reflection that allows us to reconnect and to reframe and to re-understand the possibilities and the propositions of this tradition, and then to walk away with it with an informed and very appropriate, depending on the analyses, an appropriate understanding. But the moment that we think and we work in these absolutes and these generalizations that all religion is bad or everything that is passed off as religion is good, well, this is a very simple and very flawed approach, and this is something that should be avoided.
Thank you. Brother Himad, if you wanted to speak, go ahead.
Oh, assalamu alaikum, Brother Zubair. Thank you for letting me just say one thing. I wish I would have been able to contribute more, but unfortunately I haven't been able. I've just been listening on and off. I just wanted to say one thing, and I think it kind of goes with what Brother Salim, Brother Ahmad was saying. And so I just wanted to point a thing, because we've talked about kind of how this, how these kids, or even how Brother Afghan Polymath just mentioned, how even older people can fall into this kind of extremism and become Talibs later in life, and how we can talk to them. And from my experience trying to reason with them, I do agree with them. It's very difficult to reason with people who are in that kind of Wahhabi, Deobandi, Salafi box, because they're taught in their own little groups on how to what arguments to use when they're talking with people, Sunni Islam. And there are certain ways on how to talk to them, and perhaps it would be good to have a space on how to do that, because they use certain arguments that are very easily refutable. So that I will just say one thing, but then the main thing I wanted to mention is I just wanted to just read a very short excerpt in a book about how education, how much it has differed from these poor kids in these Ahl Sunnah, Ahl Hadith and Ahl Hadith and these madrasas and Pakistan, how they're indoctrinated into these extremist views, compared to how education was just, I apologize for the background noise, but how education was traditionally in the Muslim world within the last 400 years. So I'll just go for one more minute. I'll just read this excerpt. But basically, this is from the book. It's called God and Logic in Islam, Caliphate of Reason by John Walbridge. He's an assistant professor at the University of Indiana, or Indiana University. And basically, he says that traditionally, the schools in these Muslim lands were very akin to the Latin and Greek classical schools in Europe. And when a young child entered these schools in the Muslim world, the first thing they would study is, the classical language within their own vernacular, usually Punjabi or Urdu. He's talking specifically about the Indian subcontinent, so Pakistan, India. The books studied were either religious or didactic. So didactic as in, moralistic, and there was a strong moralistic element to the instruction. Thus, the first book the students studying would be Sadi's Gulistan. And the Gulistan is a collection of stories and fables providing a moral guidance for life. So this is the first book that these kids would study in these religious schools. Later books would tell tales of kings and their good and bad deeds, valuable guidance for someone to eventually be one of what the British referred to as chiefs of the Punjab. A boy in Islamic schools might, if he was bright and interested, go on to be a professional cleric. So just to contrast this traditional educational system, which was kind of turned upside down, with what these kids are going through right now. So I just wanted to kind of mention that as far as people who may be confused as far as where are we now and how was it like before, and how the question how can we get to where we were before. This is a question for us obviously in the West also. We kids send our kids to religious schools, they study, they memorize, great, but kind of having these foundational texts, the Sadi's Gulistan, moralistic books, things of this nature to kind of give them a comprehensive education akin to what kids usually would study in like a liberal arts setting. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that. If it'd be great if anybody has anything to add on that. But if not, it's a beautiful space. Thank you, Ahmad, brother Ahmad Salim. Definitely, we'll continue to follow, your opinions and thoughts on Twitter. But yeah, assalamu alaikum. Thank you.
تشکر حماد جان. لطف شماست. I agree. The traditional scholarly approach, both in formal institutions, but also we often tend to forget in informal, at-home learning, incorporated this very rich tradition and heritage of didactic texts, of poetry, of hikayat and moral tales, what is referred to as wisdom literature. And it was a way for the individual to become refined and for an individual to not only have access points to speech. And one of the things that I want to just emphasize is if you know how many of these talibs speak, they speak in a very scattered and in a very unrefined manner. They speak in a place of unsettledness. They speak from a place of violence and aggressiveness. And this is very much indicative of a flaw and an absence of rootedness in the religious and spiritual tradition and the refinement of character, which has been a very deep and the aims of religion and religiosity. When we look at traditional scholars in Afghanistan, traditional scholars both in the past and up to recent times, prior to the devastation brought on by the murder of multiple scholars and the abduction and disappearance of intellectuals and teachers and doctors and artists and others during the time of the communists and beyond that, is the destruction and the dissolution of these traditional sites and these centers of learning and appropriate networks of channeling knowledge from one generation to the next. But all these scholars were rooted in poetic and literary knowledge and in the spiritual path. The modern teachers of Afghanistan's literature are primarily two people. It is Qari Abdullah and Sufi Abdul Haq Daytab. Both of them were not only deep scholars of the religious tradition, but they were fundamentally fluent and refined scholars of literature, of poetry, and of the mystical order. And both of them, if you look at the very first classes of literary scholars who then went on to become very notable scholars of the Farsi language and poetry in Afghanistan and beyond in the Farsi-speaking world, they were students of Ustad Baitab, and it included many females. And Ustad Baitab, who himself was a very traditional scholar, had no issue sitting in a classroom with female students who didn't wear the hijab, right? And this is very much indicative of the type of milieu and the type of approach that existed in traditional societies, wherein this type of takfir and this weaponization of disbelief wasn't very easily deployed. And same thing with Qari Abdullah, who taught a number of students in the modern formation of schools in Afghanistan, as well as responsible for most of the Farsi curriculum of these schools, was a very deep scholar of mysticism and of the Quran and of literature and of poetry, and he had correspondences with Malik al-Sharai of Iran and other things. And yes, and one thing I want to add is that the engagement with texts such as that of Sheikh Sadi and other scholars wasn't just confined to the Muslim world. If you look at, for example, the Mughals, and during their rule, you have Hindus and Jains and people of the Jain and inclination and others who actually read these texts. So Farsi was really a global language. And these texts were read not only by Muslims and Muslim scholars, but also by non-Muslims and non-Muslim scholars as ways of enculturation, of education, of reflection, and of personal refinement. And it's very important to return to these texts. Yes, I agree.
Perfect. We'll just let Mariam John have one last say. We think we have like 5 minutes left, so go ahead.
Thank you, Zubair John. I just wanted to say something that kind of ties into what the last three speakers were saying in regards to how to meet the Taliban with what they're projecting for people that are against the Taliban, essentially. When I think about that, I think about the Prophet ﷺ's interaction with Khalid ibn Walid. I think that's a great circumstance for us to look back on, reflect on, and use in our everyday lives. If you recall, Khalid ibn Walid had killed the Prophet's uncle, and then immediately after had gone to meet with the Prophet. And when Khalid ibn Walid went back to his people at the time that were outside of Islam, he said that man laid carpet for me, he sat down with me, he smiled with me, and he talked with me. He talked to me with compassion and humility. And it was because of that he went back to his people and he said, "You are Jahl, and I'm going into Islam." So that's something that we need to keep on the forefront of our minds, particularly with what's going on in Twitter right now. We can't meet harassment with harassment. We can't meet violence with violence or racism with racism. We have to deal with all of it with compassion, with humility, with a sense of understanding, and really extend our hands out, because essentially we're all going to stand in front of the Lord with whatever wajdan we decide to take to Him. And I think that dealing with these things with a little bit more compassion, I think, is going to go a much further way than just writing everybody off. So I just wanted to share that in regards to what the great knowledge that you guys were sharing with everyone earlier. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam John. Yes, there's a replete and surfeit amount of narratives and examples that are present with respect to generosity and kindness and forgiveness. I would also just like to qualify one thing and add that I noted earlier, and I agree with you, that we should not echo the ignorance and the violence and the parochialism that a lot of individuals engage with. But when it comes to generosity, when it comes to sort of extending a hand, we should also be mindful of to whom we are extending our hand to, right? And Islam and practical knowledge calls for sophistication in the way that we engage with others. So we should be very mindful not to extend our hand to the one who has a sword ready to cut it. And for any individual, as I noted, who is sincere and engaged in an honest pursuit and an honest conversation, yes, absolutely. But for those with ulterior motives and with those who are rooted in violence, I think instead of looking to extend compassion to them, there has to be movement. There has to be shifts that offer. And as long as we do our work, and as long as you do your work with sincerity and with ethical refinement, then those who are inclined towards that will be attracted to it. And those who are disinclined towards it, and then they will pursue in their own ways. But it should not pollute and it should not be adulterated in any way. And in that point, I completely agree with you. So thank you for bringing that up.
My Hanjan, if you're still here, actually he's not. All right, that's fine. So I think that's enough for today. Inshallah, we're gonna continue this next week. The space will be in Farsi, so please join that space as well. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you, everyone. So before you leave, go ahead and follow We Are NRF right now on Twitter to get further updates on our next series. Thank you.
Tashakar, Sapas, and thank you to everyone. Khala Hafiz.